Hello, and thank you for choosing this clean, historical Western romance by Emma Ashwood. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support allows us to keep sharing more wonderful stories for free. So grab a cozy spot, kick back, and let this story whisk you away to a different time and place. Enjoy. Copyright Emma Ashwood. The Orphan Train to Montana by Emma Ashwood, Chapter 1. The year 1866. Steam came off the great black engine in clouds. The boy had never stood so near to anything so alive. It towered over him, taller than any wagon, taller than a house. Its iron flanks were streaked with soot. Deep inside it, a fire roared. He could feel the heat of it even here, a strange warmth in the gray cold of the dawn. The engine hissed and breathed. It shuddered on its rails like a beast that wished to run. Then the whistle screamed, sudden and shrill. The boy flinched hard. At once, he was ashamed of the flinch. All down the platform, the other children flinched too. There were a great many of them, 24 perhaps or more. Everyone had been scrubbed pink and dressed in stiff, donated clothes. Everyone wore a paper tag pinned to the breast. They stood in clusters in the thin light, small and uncertain, their breath smoking in the cold. They were bound west, all of them, up the same long iron road. Not one knew what waited at the end of it. A name was not among the boy's few possessions. In the streets he had been called many things. Some were only cruel, others were worse. Not one had ever felt like his. He had answered to whatever got him fed and let the rest fall away. A boy with no people learned not to set much store by names. There was no one to call him in to supper. There was no one to say his name over him with love. What he owned instead was a handful of hard knowledge. He knew the smell of wet brick after rain. He knew the cold of a doorway at 3 a.m. The stone took the warmth out of a body and gave nothing back. He knew the long ache of an empty belly. It gnawed worst just before dawn when the city was quiet. These were his only true possessions. A boy in his place learned not to want for more. Wanting only made the having harder. Of his mother, he remembered nothing he could trust. There had been a woman once, perhaps, far back at the beginning of him. A low voice in the dark, a hand smoothing his hair off his brow, a warmth he could not name. It came to him sometimes between waking and sleep, then was gone before he could hold it. The memory was thin as smoke. It would not stand still to be looked at. His father was not even that much. There was simply no one there, a blank where other children kept a face. 10 years old he was, or near enough. No one had ever told him the day of his birth, so he had chosen one for himself long ago, a day in early spring. It seemed a hopeful sort of month to belong to. The hard frosts were breaking by then. The first thin green showed at the edges of the gutters. A boy could believe in spring that the worst was behind him. He had needed to believe that. So he gave himself a spring birthday and told no one, for there was no one to tell. Until a week passed, the narrow streets had been his whole world. He had run errands for pennies, darting between the carts. He had carried parcels too heavy for his thin arms. The string cut red lines into his fingers. When the pennies failed, he slept where he could. A stairwell, if he found one unlocked. The lee of a chimney. Once, through a whole hard winter, the boards beneath a stranger's porch. Then the men from the Children's Aid Society found him asleep under a market stall. He had slept there 3 nights running, curled small against the cold brick wall. They were not unkind, those men. They lifted him by the collar the way a man lifts a kitten. They brushed the wet straw from his coat with brisk, impersonal hands. They turned his face up to the gray light to look him over. One of them nodded as if a small sum had come out right. "This one will do," said the taller of them, young enough yet to be placed out. A great brick building swallowed him after that. It was full of children, more than he had ever seen in one place. They lined the benches and the long, bare rooms. None of them laughed. None played the way children in the streets still found ways to play. They only waited. They had the patient, hollow stillness of those who have learned that waiting is most of life. The boy took his place among them and waited too. He was good at waiting. It was nearly all he had ever done. In a tin bath, a stern-faced woman scrubbed him until his skin glowed. She worked at him with a hard brush and a cake of yellow soap, neck and ears and the backs of his hands. The water went black around his knees, then browner still. He had not known he carried so much of the city upon him. He watched it sluice away. He felt strangely lighter for the loss of it, and strangely smaller too. A stiff shirt came next, smelling sharply of lye. The cloth scratched at his washed neck. Then the woman pinned the paper tag to his breast and stood back to judge her work. What the tag said he could not read. No one had ever taught him his letters. The marks upon it were a fence he could not see over. He turned his eyes up to the woman instead and waited to be told their meaning. "You are going west," she said. "Out west, there are families who want children. You will be chosen by one of them. Mind you behave and mind you smile." Chosen. The word turned over in him like a coin held warm in a closed fist. He kept it close. He did not let it show on his face. To show a thing was the surest way to have it taken, but it glowed there, down in his chest, small and stubborn and bright. Somewhere west, there was a family. Somewhere there was a door that would open for him. They had brought the children to the station before light. Now a young woman moved down the platform, counting heads, marking them in a small book. Miss Cornwell, she said her name was. She had a tired, careful face. It was the face of a woman who has done a hard thing many times and means to do it well once more. She promised to see them safely west. The boy believed her, more or less. She had kind eyes under the tiredness. 2 by 2, the children climbed aboard. A seat by the window fell to the boy. The hard wood was worn smooth by other travelers. A smaller child pressed in beside him, sniffling, clutching a rag doll with one button eye. The boy said nothing to him. Speaking led to knowing. Knowing led to losing. That was a sum he had worked out long ago in a colder place than this. So he kept his peace. He looked out through the smeared glass and waited for the world to move. Then the cars lurched and the platform began to slide away. He pressed his face to the cold glass. The brick walls of his only world slipped past, faster and faster until they blurred. Yards gave way to scattered houses. The houses thinned to fields, and then there was only land. More of it than he had dreamed could exist. It rolled out flat and brown beneath a wide, pale sky, so much of anything he had never seen. It frightened him a little, that bigness. It thrilled him, too. Up and down the aisle Miss Cornwell went, drilling them gently as the miles unspooled. "Sit up straight," she told them. "Do not slouch. When a family looks at you, look back kindly. Answer every question clear and polite. Do not whine and do not sulk." Beside the boy, she stopped a moment and her voice dropped lower. "The good homes go to the children who please," she said. "No one chooses a sullen child. No one chooses a sickly one. Remember it." A nod was all he gave her, but he understood her down to the ground. Making himself useful enough to be fed was the one trade he had ever learned. He knew how to be quiet. He knew how to be quick. He knew how to read a grown person's mood and bend to it. If smiling was the price of a home, he would smile until his face ached and call it cheap. Hour upon hour, the land slid by. Towns came and went, no more than a clutch of low roofs against the sky. They were gone before he could fix his eyes on them. Rivers flashed silver in the distance and were lost again. Cattle stood in far fields like scattered stones. And the whole long while, he thought of the family that might be waiting out there. A mother with a warm, low voice, like the one half remembered in the dark. A father who might set a hand on his shoulder and call him son. The hope was not spoken aloud. It was barely even thought. Still it burned in him, fierce and secret and bright. Across the aisle, an older boy watched him with flat, knowing eyes. 13, perhaps, lean and hard, with a white scar splitting one eyebrow. He had the look of a boy who had stopped expecting anything good. "You're hoping," the older boy said. It was not a question. The boy gave no answer. "I can see it on you. First-timers always hope." Bitterness soured every word. "I've ridden this train before. Twice. 2 homes. Both of them sent me back." The smaller child stopped his sniffling to listen. Still the boy kept his own face shut as a door. "They don't want sons out here," the older boy went on. "They want hands, strong backs for the fields. You're a thing to be used, same as a plow or a mule. The little soft ones, maybe they get loved. Not us. Never us. You'll see." "You don't know that," the boy said. It was the first word he had spoken all day. A laugh answered him, with no joy in it. I know it better than I know anything, the older boy said. Then he turned to his own window and said no more. The silence he left behind was worse than his words. The boy turned back to his own glass. The endless grass ran gold in the falling light. Bitter men see only the worst, he told himself. The older boy was bitter clean through. Somewhere ahead, a door stood open, surely, with lamplight spilling warm onto a swept step. But a small, cold seed had been planted, and it would not be dug out. A strong back, a thing to be used. The words lodged in his chest beside the bright hope. The two of them did not lie easy together. He turned them over and could not make them stop. Night came down over the plains. The cold crept into the car, up through the floorboards, in around the window frames. Beside him, the small child slept at last, worn out with weeping. His head tipped slowly onto the boy's thin shoulder. Very still, the boy held himself so as not to wake him. He looked down at the rag doll with its one-button eye, a knot pulled tight in his chest and would not loosen. Sleep was a long time coming. Beneath him, the wheels beat their steady iron rhythm, on and on. They carried him through the dark toward whatever waited at the end of the line. He stared into the black glass and saw only his own faint face staring back. Choose me, he thought, to the country he could no longer see. Whoever you are out there, please, just choose me. I will be so good. I will work so hard. You will never once be sorry that you did. West the train ran through the night, and west the boy rode with it. A tag pinned to his coat, a doll clutching stranger asleep on his shoulder. He was bound for a family he could not picture and could not, for all his trying, stop himself from wanting. Chapter 2. A raw Missouri town was where the train set them down at last. It was little more than a single street of plank buildings, raised up out of the prairie as though by accident. A church stood at one end, its paint already peeling. A store, a livery with a sagging roof. The smell of horses carried clear across the road. The boy stepped down onto the boards, his legs stiff from the long days of sitting. The air met him with a smell of dust and sun-warmed wood. Beneath it lay a green smell he could not name, the breath of the open country. It was nothing like the city. There was too much sky. Miss Cornwell formed them into a line along the platform. She went down the row with quick, practiced hands. She straightened a collar here. She licked her thumb and scrubbed a smudge from a cheek there. The boy's paper tag had worked itself crooked. She tugged it straight upon his coat. Then she gave the front of him a small pat, as if to settle both the cloth and the child inside it. "Stand tall," she murmured to each of them as she passed. "Smile. This may be the day a family takes you home." To the meeting house at the end of the street they were marched, 2 by 2. A crowd had already gathered there, more people than the boy had expected. Farmers in worn coats, their hands thick and brown, their wives in faded bonnets. A few children of the town come to stare at the children off the train. Their eyes moved over the orphans, the way a man's eyes move over stock at a sale. Weighing, measuring, pricing. The boy had seen that look before at the markets back home, turned upon hogs and horses. It was the look of people deciding what a thing was worth. He had not known until that moment how it felt to be the thing. Along a low platform at the front, the children were ranged in a row. A man in a black coat read aloud from a paper. These were orphans of good character, he told the crowd. Healthy and willing in one of Christian homes, ready to be useful to those who took them. The boy hardly heard the words. He was busy at the only work he knew. He stood straight, his shoulders squared and aching. He smiled until the muscles of his face burned with it. It was a wide, hopeful smile that he did not feel anywhere inside. Forward, the families came to look. A round woman with kind eyes stopped first before the little ones. She bent down to them, cooing, and lifted a small, fair girl onto one hip. The girl laughed, surprised into it. The woman laughed back, delighted, and carried her off without a backward glance. A man with a gray beard swung the sniffling child with the rag doll onto his broad shoulders. The child gripped his hair and crowed. One by one, the soft, pretty little ones were gathered up and led away into the bright morning. The boy watched each of them go. He was glad for them. Underneath the gladness, he was very much afraid. Over him, the looker's eyes passed and moved on. He understood it in a dim and wordless way. He was thin, and he was plain. There was nothing in his face to make a stranger's heart go soft. 10 was a poor age to be standing in such a line. He was too old to be cooed over and gathered up like a kitten. He was too young to be of much real use in a field. A woman did not look at a boy like him and ache to hold him. He knew it. Still he kept the smile fixed upon his face. Still he squared his aching shoulders and held them so. The right family had only not yet come down the line, he told himself. He had only to wait and be good and not despair. The crowd thinned as the morning wore on. The little ones were gone, every one. A handful of older children remained upon the platform, the boy among them. They no longer troubled to smile. The bright hope he had carried all the long way west had begun to ache. It was a dull pain, low in his chest, like a bruise pressed on. She were sent. Then a couple stopped before him. The man was tall and hard, with a face like a closed fist. His wife stood a pace behind him, thin-lipped, her hands folded at her waist. Neither of them smiled. Neither spoke a kind word to the boy or to one another. The man looked him over slow, the way he might judge a horse he meant to buy cheap. "This one," the man said at last. "How old?" "10, sir," the boy said quickly, clear and polite, just as he had been taught. He made the word bright, he made it eager. He put into that one small sir every ounce of please, take me a boy could press into a syllable. The man stepped close. One rough hand closed on the boy's arm and squeezed, hard, feeling for the muscle beneath the sleeve. The boy held himself still and let it happen. Then the fingers came up to his jaw and pried his mouth open. The man turned his head to the light, the way he might check the teeth of a mule. The boy stood and bore it. He fixed his eyes on a knot in the planking and did not let them fill. Heat flooded his face, but he made no sound. Shame was a lesson he had learned long ago and in hard places. He had learned to swallow it down whole and let no one see. "Sound enough," the man said over his shoulder to his wife. "Strong arms for his age. He'll grow." "Does he eat much?" the woman asked. She spoke as though the boy were not standing there at all. "He'll earn what he eats," the man said, "or he'll go without." The couple turned to Miss Cornwell and the man with the black coat. There was talk the boy could not quite follow, low and brief, the words passing over his head. A pen was dipped in an inkwell. Names were set down in a ledger. No one asked the boy his name. No one in all of it spoke to him at all. It was finished in less time than it took to draw a bucket of water. The man folded the paper into his coat and turned away. He did not glance back at the child he had just acquired, and the boy understood it then with a child's terrible clarity. He had not been chosen. There had been no choosing in it, no wanting, no glad heart. He had been bought. He was a sound purchase, the way the sway-backed horse was a sound purchase. Nothing more than that, nothing warmer. "Come along," the man said. "Wagons this way. Don't dawdle." Once the boy looked back over his shoulder at Miss Cornwell. She caught his eye across the thinning crowd. She gave him a small, tired nod, almost an apology, almost a blessing. Then she bent again to her book and her remaining charges. There were children yet to place, and the long day was getting on. A woman in her trade could not afford to grieve over one boy among so many. The boy understood that, too. He turned and went. He followed the hard couple out into the street. Craw was their name, he gathered from the few words that passed. Esra and Greer Craw. They had a farm some miles out from the town, the man said. There was work waiting on it. They had come a fair distance for a strong pair of hands. The boy walked behind them to a buckboard wagon, hitched to a sway-backed horse with a hanging head. He was told to climb up into the back. He sat among the sacks of flour and the coils of new harness leather. They had been bought on the same trip to town that had bought him. He climbed up and sat down among the sacks. With a creak and a jolt, the wagon rolled. The little town slid away behind him, the meeting house and the platform and Miss Cornwell with it. Soon, the whole of it was no more than a smudge of roofs against the wide sky. Glad he ought to be, he told himself. A home was his now, of a kind. A roof. A place. He had not been sent back down the line as the scarred boy on the train had been sent back twice. Surely that counted for something. Surely it was a beginning. And surely, the boy thought, if only he worked hard enough. If only he made himself useful enough, and quiet and good. Then the cold faces in the front seat might, in time, soften toward him. People could come to love a thing that served them well. He had seen a man fond of a good dog. Why not, in time, a good boy? To that thought he held as the miles unspooled. He held to it the way a drowning man holds to a floating board. The land opened out around them, brown and rolling, stitched with rail fences gone gray. Crows lifted in a black scatter from a stubbled field and settled again. Neither of the crows spoke a word, not to him, not even to one another. There was only the creak of the wheels, the plod of the tired horse, the wind in the long grass. Hugging his thin knees against the chill, the boy watched the road dwindle behind him. It does not matter why they took me, he thought, so long as they keep me. He said the words over to himself, silently, a charm against the cold. He said them until they almost felt true. Toward dusk, the wagon turned down a rutted lane. At its end stood a low farmhouse, gray and unpainted, weathered to the color of an old bone. Behind it loomed a barn, larger than the house itself. Its great door hung dark and open. A dog barked once from the yard and was hushed by a word from Ezra. In no window of the house did a lamp burn. There was no warm square of light to say a family lived within. There were only gray shapes against a graying sky. The boy looked at the dark house and the darker barn and waited to be told what would become of him. "That's the place," Ezra Cross said, without turning his head. "You'll sleep in the barn. We'll start you at first light." The bright hope the boy had carried all the long way west flickered low at the words. But it did not yet go out. He gathered it close inside him, small and stubborn and warm. He would not let the dark and the cold of the place put it out. Useful he would be, he swore to himself as the wagon rolled into the silent yard. So useful that they could not help but come to love him in the end. He did not yet know that being useful and being loved were two different things. He did not know he would spend the whole of his boyhood learning the bitter distance between the one and the other. Chapter 3. Whole and entire, the Craw farm swallowed the boy down. There was no easing into it. There was no first gentle day. The work took him the morning after he arrived. It did not let him go again for years. Before light each morning, a fist pounded the barn door. That was his waking, every day of every season. No voice called him kindly. No hand shook his shoulder. There was only the fist on the rough plank. There was the black dark beyond it. There was the long list of chores that did not care whether a boy had slept. He learned to be on his feet before the pounding stopped. A slow rising earned hard words and worse. Then came the work itself, in the same order, day upon day. The mucking of the stalls first, the heavy fork and the steaming muck, then the hauling of water from the well, 2 buckets at a time. The icy handles bit his fingers. The feeding of the hogs, who shoved and squealed and tried to knock him down. The gathering of the eggs from under the cross hens, wood split and carried until his thin arms shook. By the time the sun cleared the trees, a grown man's half-day already lay behind him, and the day was only beginning. A stall in the barn was his bed. He had straw for a mattress and an old horse blanket against the cold. It was stiff and smelled of the animal. In summer, it was bearable. In winter, the cold rose up through the packed earth and into his bones. It settled there and would not be driven out. So he learned the tricks of the stray and the orphan. He learned to burrow deep down into the straw, where his own breath could warm a little hollow. He learned to sleep curled small and tight, the way a dog sleeps in a doorway. Nothing of himself was left out to the frost. Whatever the Craws left when they had finished was his to eat. Scraps, mostly. Cold boiled potatoes with the salt gone off them, the dry heel of a loaf, a rind of bacon when the luck was running. In the corner of the kitchen, he ate it standing or out on the step in the cold. He ate it fast, the way a boy eats who has known the food to be taken back. Never once in all his years beneath that roof was he told to sit at the table. The table was for the family. He was not that. Ezra Craw's belt taught faster than his tongue. A spilled pail of milk earned a stripe across the back. A gate left unlatched earned 2. A tool left out in the weather, a chore done slow, a word answered wrong. Each had its price. The price was paid in leather. The man did not shout much. He did not need to. He had a flat, deliberate way of reaching for his belt that said more than shouting. The boy learned the rules of that farm the way an animal learns a hot stove. He learned them quick. He carried the lessons in welts beneath his shirt. Greer Craw never once struck him. A colder cruelty than the belt was her way. She looked through him when she looked at all. He might have been a tool somebody had propped in the corner, a tool that happened inconveniently to need feeding. Chores, she said him in a flat, tired voice, and turned away before he could answer. His answer was of no more interest to her than the lowing of a cow. In all his years beneath her roof, he could not call up a single time she had touched him with her hand. The one exception was to take him by the shoulder and push him towards some task not yet done. Yet the hope did not die in the boy. Not at first. Harder than he was bidden, he worked. He rose earlier than the fist required. He sought out the chores no one had thought to ask of him, and did those too. A fence sagging on its post he mended before he was told. A well rope gone frayed he spliced fresh. Surely, he thought, if he were useful enough, the cold would in time begin to melt. Love in his child's heart was a thing a boy could earn. It was a wage, like a crust of bread. A boy had only to work hard enough and be good. One day it would be paid. So the farm he learned down to its very bones. The animals he came to know, each of them, and all their tempers. Which cow would lash out with a hind foot, which would stand sweet and patient for the milking, which horse spooked at shadows, which hog would bite. The weather he learned to read in the smell and the feel of the wind. A scythe he learned to swing without cutting his own leg. A snare he learned to set. The sky he learned to study for the coming of rain. Lean and quick and strong past his years, he grew. Good, he grew too, truly good at all the work of the place. And still the love did not come. The one mercy of those hard years went by the name of Prout. He was the hired hand, old and bent, with a face like a strip of cracked harness leather. A white stubble he never quite managed to shave clean. He had worked the Craw place longer than anyone could rightly say. Longer than Ezra had owned it, some said. In the stall beside the boys he slept. Through the long nights he snored like a saw, working its slow way through green wood. It was Prout who first spoke to the boy as a person and not as a plow. "Pull that calf wrong. You'll break its leg and your own back," the old man said one morning. He took the rope from the boy's raw and fumbling hands. "Here now, you work with the creature, not against it. You feel which way it wants to come, and you help it that way. Gentle, see? Slow. There." He showed him how, his old hands sure and patient on the rope. And in the showing, something passed between the man and the boy. The boy had not felt it since the warm, low voice in the dark. That was so long ago now that he half believed he had dreamed it. It was a small thing. It was only a man troubling to teach a boy his work properly, for the boy's own sake. But the boy had gone so long without it that it near undid him. After that, the old man taught him a great many things. To gentle a frightened horse with a low word and a flat, still palm. To read a steer's mood by the set of its ears before ever it kicked. To whittle a rough whistle from a green stick and coax a tune from it. One slow gray Sunday, when the work was light, Prout sat on an upturned pail. He carved the boy a small horse out of a block of pine. He handed it over without a word and went back to his pipe. That pine horse the boy kept hidden deep in the straw of his stall. At night he drew it out and held it in the dark. He ran his thumb over the smooth carved back of it. In all the wide world, it was the only gift ever given to him freely. It asked nothing back. It was not a wage, nor a trade, nor a thing earned by being good. It was simply his, because an old man had wished him to have it. He could not have said why that made his throat go tight, but it did, every time. Tobacco smell and dry jokes the old man shared with him. Now and again, half of his own meager supper. A soft word was never among the gifts. That was not Prout's way, and the boy did not look for it. But kind he was, in the gruff manner of hard old men, in deeds far more than words. The boy drank that small, rough kindness down the way a thirsty man drinks water. He took it with his whole parched self, grateful past saying. "Why do they hate me?" the boy asked him once, late in the dark of the barn. "I do everything right. I work harder than anyone. Why won't they ever just like me?" A long while the old man was quiet. The boy thought he had fallen asleep and was sorry he had asked. "They don't hate you, son. Prout said at last, his voice rough and low. Hating takes more feeling than they've got to spare on the likes of us. You're a good back to them, a pair of hands. That's all they ever sent away for. That's all they'll ever trouble to see. But if I'm good enough, the boy began. You already are good enough. The old man's voice was almost gentle now. You hear me? That was never the question, boy. It was never that. Some folks just haven't got it in them to give. Not to a child that isn't their own. There's no working hard enough to squeeze it out of a dry stone. Now hush and sleep. Morning comes early in this house, same as always. Long after the snores started up again, the boy lay awake in the straw. Over and over he turned the little pine horse in his fingers, feeling the shape of it in the dark. The old man's words sat heavy in him. He turned those over too and could not make them lie easy. Prout he did not believe, not yet. He was not ready to. To believe the old man was to give up the one bright thing that had kept him warm. It had warmed him through every cold barn night, through every cuff and every cold supper eaten alone on the step. It was the hope. The hope that one day, if he only tried hard enough, he would be loved. He could not let it go. It was nearly all he had. So for a while longer, he held to it. Before light, he rose. Till dark, he worked. Each small scrap of kindness he saved up like a miser saving coins. The half-supper, the pine horse, the patient lessons. He hoarded them against the long cold of the place. And he told himself, against all the plain evidence of his days, that his patience would be rewarded in the end. It had to be. A thing earned so dearly had to be paid at last. Year upon year, the boy worked and waited to be loved. And year upon year, the love did not come. So slowly that he scarcely marked the change. A hard question took shape in him. It was the same hard truth the old man had tried to hand him in the dark of the barn. It had come now to take root on its own, in its own bitter time. Perhaps being useful and being wanted were not the same thing at all. Chapter 4. 15 the boy was when the Craws went to meet another train. 5 years had passed since his own arrival. He was tall now and hard with work, his hands gone broad and calloused. The thin city child was long gone. In his place stood a lean farm boy who could do a man's labor, and often did. Why they hitched the wagon and drove off toward town that morning, the Craws did not say. They never told him their business. Supplies, he supposed, or some matter at the bank. He spent the day splitting wood in the cold, bright air. He was glad, if anything, of the quiet with Ezra gone. When the wagon rolled back at dusk, he came out to take the horse as he always did. He expected nothing. He had long since learned to expect nothing. A child sat in the seat between them. The boy stopped where he stood. The little one was small and fair and round-cheeked, no more than 5. He wore a clean wool coat, too fine for the Craws' usual buying. In his small fists he clutched a paper sack of candy. Greer Craw had one arm about his shoulders, holding him close against the cold, and she was smiling. Never once in 5 long years had the boy seen Greer Craw smile. The sight of it stopped him cold in the middle of the yard, the way a slap stops a man. He had not known her face could do that. He had thought it made of harder stuff. "This is Thomas," Ezra said, climbing down stiffly from the seat. "He's to be our son. You'll mind him, and you'll mind your tongue around him. Our son." Like a blade slid clean and quiet between the ribs, the 2 small words went into him. He stood holding the horse's bridle and could not make himself move. The horse stamped and blew, wanting its stall. Still he could not move. The words had gone in too deep. For the jealousy he waited. He waited to feel the hot rush of it, to hate the small fair child in the wagon. But the hatred did not come. What came instead was something far worse. It was a clarity, cold and clean and complete. It took the very breath from him where he stood. These people could love a child. They were not made of stone, as he had half let himself believe. The warmth had been in them the whole time, all those years. The soft arm, the smile, the fine wool coat and the sack of candy. They had it in them to give and to spare. Year upon year they had looked at the boy in their barn. And every single day they had chosen never to spend a drop of it on him. It was not that they could not love. It was that he was not worth the loving to them. 5 long years, he had told himself that hard work would earn him a place at their table. Now the truth lay bare in the yard before him. plain as the new boy's shining face. The place had never once been on offer. It was not a place he had failed to earn. It was a place that had never been for sale to him at all. Bought as a hand, he was kept as one. And so he would be kept until the day he wore out. Then he would be turned off, the way a man turns off a lamed horse, without a backward look. Little Thomas was given the small warm room off the kitchen, the one with the real bed. To the town school the child went in shining new boots. At the table he sat for every meal, in the chair the boy had never been asked to fill. The boy carried him on his shoulders when he was bidden. He mended the child's toys with his own clever hands. He pulled him dripping from the creek the day the little one wandered too near. Toward Thomas himself the boy felt no anger, not a flicker of it. The child had not made the cruel world. He was only a small boy who had been chosen, warm and whole and wanted, exactly as the boy himself had once longed to be. But some last green and hoping part of the boy began that fall to harden over for good. He went on with the work, as he always had. He milked in the cold, dark mornings. He split the wood and hauled the water and bent his back to the plow. But he did it now with a quiet stone in his chest, where the hope had been. He no longer rose early to seek out the unasked chores. He no longer watched the kitchen window for a softening that would never come. He did his work. He took his scraps. He kept his own counsel. A hardness set into his young face that fall and did not soften again for 30 years. Prout saw it happen. A chill had taken the old man that summer, deep in the chest, and he could not shake it loose. By the first hard frost, he kept to his stall most days, gray-faced and laboring for breath. Every breath was a wet rattle in him. On top of all his own chores, the boy now did the old man's too. He brought him water. He carried him what scraps of food he could. In the cold evenings, he sat with him in the dark of the barn. They were the only company either of them had. "You've gone quiet," Prout said to him one night. Thin his voice was now, worn down near to a thread. "Quieter than your usual, and that's saying a thing for you." "They've a son now," the boy said simply. "A real one." Silent, the old man went for a long moment. Then he reached out through the dark. He found the boy's hand and held it in his own. Never before in all the years had he done such a thing. "Listen to me, son," Prout said. "I haven't got long here, and I'll not waste the breath I've left. So mind what I tell you now. Mind it well." "Don't talk that way," the boy began. "Hush now, mind me." The old grip tightened on his hand. "There's no earning what these people won't give. You hear me? You could work yourself clean into the grave for them. It would buy you not one thing. The fault was never in you, boy. It was never that you weren't good enough, nor strong, nor quick. You were always good enough. Always. The lack was in them, not ever in you." The boy's throat had gone tight as a fist. No words would come past it. "You're near grown now," the old man went on, his breath rasping between the words. "Strong, quick, good with stock as any man I ever knew. Out west of here, past the river, there's a whole wide country. A man can stand on his own 2 feet there. Don't wear out your life waiting on a love these folk will never hand you. Go where you're not a tool. Go where a man's measured by more than his back. Promise me that. Promise an old man that much." "I promise," the boy whispered, though he did not yet know whether he could ever keep it. Satisfied, the old man nodded slow and let his eyes fall closed. "Good, that's good then. Now, there's a thing I want you to have." Beneath the straw, the old hand fumbled a moment and drew out a clasp knife. It was worn smooth with 40 years of handling. The bone handle had gone the soft yellow color of old ivory. Into the boy's palm, Prout pressed it and closed the boy's fingers over it with his own. "Had it 40 years, the old man said. "Good steel that, keen. It'll see you a long way down the road if you treat it right and keep it sharp. A man ought to own one fine thing in his life. Now you do." Around the warm bone of the handle, the boy closed his fingers tight. The blur in his eyes would not let him see the old man's face. He was glad of the dark of the barn. Prout would not see the tears and think him still a child. "Thank you," he managed at last. "Go on and sleep now," Prout said gently. "And remember what I told you. There's no earning it. Stop your trying to. Save your strength for the road." Before the week was out, old Prout died. He went quiet in the night, with no more fuss than he had ever made over anything. At the edge of the far field, the Craws buried him in a plain pine box. No stone was set up to mark the place. Ezra grumbled aloud at the loss of a day's good work for the digging. Then it was done, and the dirt was tamped down. The farm went on its way as though the old man had never once drawn breath upon it. Over the raw grave the boy stood alone when the others had gone in to their supper. The pine horse was in one pocket of his coat. The clasp knife was in the other. They were the two things the old man had given him. They were the only true gifts of his whole life. The wind moved cold across the stubbled field. The newly turned earth was dark against the pale, dead grass. No stone marked it, and there would be none. In a year, the grass would close over the place. In 2, no living soul would know that a man lay there at all. The boy stood and looked down at it for a long while. He thought of the rope lessons, the carved horse, the half-shared suppers. He thought of the rough old hand that had reached for his in the dark. It was the only hand, in all his years, that ever had. Whatever had kept him soft and kept him hoping was buried in that cold field along with Prout. The boy felt it go out of him. He did not weep there over the grave. The weeping was behind him now, back in the dark of the barn where no one could see. What was left was quieter and colder and far harder than tears. A vow he made there, standing over the unmarked grave, in the thin gray light of the falling year. Never again would he wait upon another soul's love. Never again would he let any man own his labor or his hope or his heart. He would be no one's tool ever again, for as long as he should live. A man he was not yet, not quite, but the boy in him was finished now, and what was left would not be broken so easily as the boy had been broken. Chapter 5. 16 he was when the end came, and it came over nothing at all. A horse had gone lame in the near pasture. It was no fault of the boy's. The animal had stepped wrong on a stone in the dark, as horses will. But Ezra Craw was in one of his black tempers that night. He needed a place to set it down. The boy was the place he always set it. "You did this," the man said, low and ugly, in the swaying lantern light of the barn. "Careless, worthless, after all I've fed you, all these years." The ground was bad, the boy said. Tired he was, bone-tired, and the words came out flatter than was wise. He was past minding his tongue that night. "It wasn't me. The stone did it, not me." To his belt, Ezra's hand went. 100 times the boy had taken that belt. More than 100. He had bent his back to it and swallowed the sting. Each time he had told himself it would buy him something in the end. Some softening, some place. But the boy who had believed that was gone now. He was buried out in the cold, far field beside old Prout. The one who stood in the barn that night was someone else entirely. Up came the belt, down it came, and the boy's hand shot out, quick as a snake, and caught the man's wrist in midair. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Huge upon the barn wall, the lantern threw their 2 locked shadows. The boy held the wrist fast. In his own grip, he felt his strength. All those years of hauling and lifting and splitting had built it into him, year by year. He had never once stopped to notice it growing. Ezra Craw was no young man anymore. The boy was nearly grown now, and hard as wintered oak. The two of them knew it in the same instant. A change came into the man's eyes. It was a small change, but it was unmistakable. The boy had seen it in cornered animals. It was fear. "Let go," Ezra said. Not so certain now, that voice. Not so cold. The boy let go. He stepped back, out of the man's reach. Nothing was left to say, and so he said nothing. There were no words in him for this. There was only the cold, sure knowledge of what had just changed between them, forever. Both of them knew it, in that long, quiet moment. He would not be staying. Never again would that belt fall across his back. That whole part of his life was over and done. A door had swung shut between 2 rooms, and the bolt thrown home. The boy felt the truth of it settle in his chest, cold and clear and strangely calm. Slowly, Ezra lowered his arm. He coiled the belt back around his fist, not looking at the boy, his jaw working. Then he turned and went out of the barn into the dark and said not another word. Alone in the lantern light, the boy stood, his heart pounding against his ribs. He waited for the shaking in his hands to pass. Sleep did not come to him that night. In the straw of his stall, he lay with his eyes wide open, watching the dark, and made his plans. They were simple plans. They did not take long to make. He had been making them somewhere down deep for a long time without knowing it. Before the first gray light, he rose. The few things he owned he gathered, and few indeed they were. The rough clothes he stood up in, a spare shirt gone thin at the elbows, the little pine horse from his pocket, the old clasp knife, warm against his palm. After 6 long years of his labor, that was the whole of it. That was all the Craw farm had given him to show for his childhood. Bread he took from the kitchen, half a loaf, no more. It was less by far than he had earned 10 times over. Beyond his honest due, he would not steal so much as a crust. His pride forbade it, and his pride was about the only thing the Craws had never managed to take from him. They had taken his childhood and his trust and his hope. They had not got that. At the door, he stopped once and looked back at the dark and silent house. No lamp burned in any window. No voice called him back. Little Thomas slept warm in the good room with the real bed. Ezra and Greer slept on, easy in the dark. Not one of the 3 would wake to find him gone before dawn. Not before the chores went undone, and the cows stood unmilked and the fire unlit. The work they would surely miss. Him they would not. That was the plain truth of it, and it no longer had the power to wound him. Out of the yard he walked, down the rutted lane, and did not look back again. Pale under the last of the stars lay the road south. He walked fast, lengthening his stride, putting hard miles between himself and the farm. With every mile, a band in his chest loosened a little more, one that had been drawn tight for years. Where he was going, he had no clear notion. Only the direction did he know. West, west, where old Prout had said a man could stand on his own 2 feet. West, away from everything he had ever been. At his back, the sun came up over the world. It lit the long grass to running gold. It threw his shadow far out ahead of him on the road, a tall, thin shape, striding ever westward. Never in his whole life had he felt so afraid, and never had he felt so free. The 2 ran together in him, the fear and the freedom, until he could not tell the one from the other. Toward midday, a great cloud of dust rose up on the southern road. Beneath it came the bawling of cattle. A trail outfit it was, driving a herd north toward the new ranges. Hundreds of steers moved together in a slow brown river, flanked by riders on either side. The dust climbed off their backs into the white midday sky. At the roadside, the boy stopped and watched them come on. A longing stirred in him toward the sight of it, toward all that motion and freedom and open country. He could not have put a name to what it was. A rider broke off from the herd and trotted his horse over. He was broad and weathered, with a heavy gray mustache, the trail boss by the look of him. "You lost, son?" the man called down from the saddle. "No, sir," the boy said. "Looking for work. I'm good with stock, cattle, horses, anything you've got. I'll do the hardest job in your outfit and not say a word of complaint." Over him, the trail boss ran a long, judging look. He took in the lean, wiry frame, the steady gaze that did not flinch, the thick calluses on the young hands. He was a man short of 2 riders already. The long drive north went hard on the few he had left. "You ride?" "Yes, sir." "Rope?" "I'll learn whatever I don't know. Fast. You won't have to tell me twice." The boy's flat, quiet certainty seemed to settle the matter. Toward the moving dust, the trail boss jerked his head. "Got a spare horse and an empty saddle. Pays poor and the work's worse than poor. You'll eat dust all day, sleep on the hard ground all night, and curse the hour you ever asked me. Still want it?" "Yes, sir," the boy said. "I want it." "Then climb on. We don't wait for any man." A horse was given to him. Up into the saddle he swung, and into the great brown herd he rode. The dust closed warm over him. The bawling of the cattle and the drum of 1,000 hooves swallowed him whole. At the flank of the herd, he found his place and held it. The trail boss watched him work a while. He nodded once to himself and rode on up the line. The other hands let him be. They saw that he was quiet and asked no more of him than that. They saw that he could sit a horse and never once shirked a hard turn. Out here, on the long trail, a man's past was his own business. They asked him nothing. He told them nothing. That suited him down to the very ground. The work was hard, harder than the farm in its way, but it was honest. A man was paid for it in coin, not in welts. The days were long in the saddle. The nights were cold on the ground. The dust got into everything. into his food and his eyes and his teeth. But no fist pounded a barn door at dawn. No belt waited at the end of a careless hour. He ate beside the fire with the other men. He took his turn at the night watch. He slept his few hours under more stars than he had known were in the sky. It was the first work of his life that was simply work, and not a debt he could never pay down. North into a vast new country, the drive carried him. The grass ran clear and unbroken to the edge of the world. The sky stood without end above it, bigger than anything the boy had known could exist. Room enough out here, he thought, looking at it. Room enough that a man might lose the boy he had been and never have to go and find him again. Through the long days, he rode. With each beat of the hooves beneath him, he made his vows over. Never again would he need another living soul. Never again would he beg to be kept. Never would he let himself be merely useful to any heart on this earth. For being useful was the very cheat that had cost him his whole childhood. He had paid that price once. He would not pay it twice. His letters he would learn one day, he swore. Land he would buy, a great deal of it, more than the Craws had ever dreamed of owning. Free and clear he would own it, every acre, and no man living would ever again pry open his mouth to count the worth of him as a man counts a mule. Somewhere along those long, hard miles, the unwanted orphan quietly buried the child he had been. Of that boy he spoke to no one. In time, he would scarcely speak of him even to himself, the pine horse he kept, and the clasp knife. But the child who had hoped, he folded away and put from him. On he rode into the dust of the great herd, alone among rough strangers, into the wide and waiting country. And there, mile by weary mile, beneath that endless sky, the boy from the train began to make himself into a man. Part 2, Chapter 6, Montana, the year 1890. 30 years can make a stranger of a boy. The orphan from the train was a man now, and the man had a name the whole county knew. Otis Dyer, master of the Bardee. His was the largest spread in the Montana high country. 10,000 acres of grass and water, one an acre at a time. Respected he was by every soul from the railhead to the foothills, warmed by none of them. The land he had sworn to own, he owned. Every promise he had made on that long drive north he had kept. He had said he would learn his letters, and he had, by lamplight, slow and stubborn, until he could read a contract closer than the man who wrote it. He had said he would buy land, and he had bought it, parcel by hard-won parcel. A fine house stood upon it now, built of squared timber and good gray stone. Glass filled every window, real glass, hauled at great cost from the east. A wide porch faced the mountains. It was the house of a man who had wanted for everything as a child and meant never to want again. And yet, for all of it, not one living soul within those walls would he have thought to call a friend. Not one he would have named a son. Morning found him on that porch, as most mornings did. He woke before the dawn, as he had his whole life. The habit was burned in, too deep to break. There had been a fist on a barn door once, long ago. The boy who had jumped to it still lived somewhere inside the man. He rose in the dark. He dressed in the cold. He came out to the porch with his coffee to watch the day come, alone. Coffee cooled in his hand. The dawn came up gray and slow over the peaks, throwing long shadows down across the valley. Cattle moved like drifting shadows across the far pasture. His cattle, more than he could count in a day's riding. Smoke rose blue from the bunkhouse chimney, where the hands took their breakfast. All of it was his. Every fence post of it he had set from nothing, with his own 2 hands and a will of iron. He looked out over the whole of it most mornings and felt the grim satisfaction of a debt collected. 40 years old he was now, and hard as wintered oak. Iron gray showed at his temples and in the stubble of his jaw. His face had weathered to rawhide, brown and seamed and giving nothing away. His eyes were a flat, cool gray, the color of a winter sky. They gave away less still. What moved behind them, no man could say. Otis Dyer had spent 30 years making certain of it. The clothes he wore were plain and well made. He wore them the way a soldier wears armor, buttoned to the throat against the world. He was a big man, and a still one. He did not waste words, nor motion, nor warmth. Men spoke careful around him, and quick to please. The hands jumped to his word and did not grumble after. In the town, his name carried weight. The bankers stood when he came in. The storekeeper kept his best buy against the chance the Bar D might want it. He had earned all of it the hard way. He knew the worth of every ounce, and not one man of them in all the county had ever clapped him on the back and called him friend. That was a thing money could not buy. It was the one thing he had never learned to ask for. A good life, the county called it. Otis was not so sure that life was the word for it. The thought had come on him more often of late, in the gray, quiet hours before the hands stirred. It was not a thought he welcomed. He could not seem to put it down. When he died, all of this would pass to strangers. He turned the bleak fact over in the dawn light. Some distant claim of the law would carry it off. Men he had never met would come and take the work of his whole hard life. They would divide it and sell it, and never once know what it had cost to build. The fences he had strung with bleeding hands would fall to people who had not set them. The herd he had bred up from nothing would scatter under some other brand. And the name he had carved out of the dirt, the name a whole county spoke with respect, would die with him in the ground. It would be as though no Otis Dyer had ever drawn breath upon the earth. That, he found, he could not abide. A man liked to think his labor meant something past his own short span. It was the one comfort left to a man with no others. Otis had no church to comfort him and no faith worth the name. He had buried whatever faith he might have had in a cold field beside an old hired man long ago. What he had instead was the land. And he had the plain, gnawing wish that it should go on belonging to someone of his own after him, an heir, a son to take the brand and keep it, and keep the name alive a while longer. For that, of course, a man required a wife. The thought sat strange in him. He had never wanted a wife. He had never wanted anyone, or let himself want them, which came in the end to the same thing. Women he had known, here and there, in the way of a man with money and no ties. None had ever touched the cold center of him. None had come close. He had seen to that. But want or no, a man could not get an heir alone, and so a wife there would have to be. He turned the problem over as he turned over any matter of business, slow and cold and without sentiment. A wife could be arranged. The same as he arranged for cattle or timber or a new well dug. He had no notion of courting and no patience for it. He had no soft words in him to spend on a woman in any case. But there were other ways. Out east were women in want of homes. Out here were men in want of wives. The newspapers carried the trade between them, plain as a notice of cattle for sale. He had heard the other ranchers speak of it, over fences and at the rail of the saloon. Mail-order brides, they called them, sensible enough to his mind. It was a clean transaction, the terms set out plain on both sides, with no foolishness about the heart. So at his desk that evening, by lamplight, he drew out paper and pen. He composed his advertisement as he might draft a contract. He did not write of love. The word never once crossed his mind, and would have shamed him if it had. A steady woman was what he set down that he wanted, of good sense and sound health, not given to nonsense nor to fits of feeling. He weighed each word as he wrote it, the way he weighed everything, for its plain truth and its price. In return, he offered security, a fine house, land enough that she would want for nothing money could buy, respectability in the eyes of the county, a roof that would never leak and a table that would never go bare. Of his own self he wrote little, and of warmth he promised nothing, for there was none in him to promise. Long ago, Otis Dyer had taught himself to do without such things. The teaching had been hard. He did not mean to throw the lesson away now. A man who needed no one could not be made to suffer for the need. A man who wanted nothing could not be made to ache for the wanting. That lesson had cost him his whole childhood. He had paid for it in the cold and the dark of another man's barn. He would not unlearn it now, not for a woman, not for anyone. He read the advertisement over twice by the guttering lamp. It was honest in its blunt and careful way. He had not pretended to be more than he was. He had not dressed himself up in tender words to lure some hopeful girl west. Whatever woman answered, it would come knowing the bargain she was making. And a bargain plainly made, to Otis's mind, was a bargain fairly kept. He could give her honesty, if nothing warmer. That was more than many got. He folded the advertisement and sealed it and set it aside for the morning post. Then he sat a while longer in the lamplight, alone in the big quiet house. The wind worked along the eaves, the way it always did. He had heard the sound so many thousand nights, he no longer rightly heard it. The rooms stretched dark and empty around him, fine and cold, and he had built them all. He had never once known what to do with them. There was a parlor he did not sit in. There were bedrooms that had never held a guest. The long table sat 12 and had never sat more than one. He had built the house big in the building years without ever asking himself why. A man who had slept in a barn stall wanted room, perhaps. Room and walls and a roof that was his own. But rooms wanted filling, and his stood empty, year upon year. The fine clock ticked in the hall to no one. The good chairs waited by the cold hearth for company that never came. He had built a house for a family, he saw now, though he had never let himself think the word. He had simply never gotten around to the family. A man could put a longing off a long time, telling himself he did not want it. Somewhere east of here, he supposed, a woman would read his words and weigh them. She would picture the life he laid out on the page. She would turn it over in her mind and decide in the end that it was enough. Enough to leave whatever she was leaving. Enough to come. In time, she would board a train and come west, as he had once come west, into a country she could not yet imagine. He wondered, for a moment only, what manner of life she was leaving behind that this cold bargain should look like the better one. The notion stirred nothing in him that he could name. He told himself it was a sound arrangement, a sensible one, and let the matter rest. Then he rose and turned down the lamp. He went up at last to his lonely, solitary bed. He did not let himself wonder what manner of woman would answer a letter so empty of tenderness. He did not let himself wonder whether she might come west hoping, the way a boy had once come west hoping for a warmth the man who sent for her had no intention of giving. Chapter 7. The train that carried Cara Fletch west was 6 days bringing her to the ranch. She watched the country change the whole long way. The green farms of the east gave over to prairie, mile upon mile of it, flat and golden under a wide sky. The prairie gave over at last to a vast and rising land of grass and far blue mountains. It was grander and emptier than anything she had ever seen. With every mile, her old life fell further behind her. With every mile, she let herself hope a little for the new one waiting at the end. She had learned in a hard school not to hope too much. She could not help but hope a little. 32 years old she was, and a widow these 2 years past. The grief she carried did not show on her face. It was a warm, steady face with kind, dark eyes. The world had not yet managed to harden the softness out of her. Her hands were work-worn, the nails kept short, the knuckles a little reddened. Her dress was plain and clean, mended neatly at one cuff where she thought it would not show. Pretty enough, she had been called in her time, though never beautiful. That had never once troubled her. Beauty was not a thing she had ever had the leisure to set store by. What troubled her in the small hours of the night was the silence where a family ought to have been. She had married young and for love, a kind man named Todd Fletch, who drove a delivery wagon through the streets of a town in Ohio. He had been no great catch, her Todd. He had no land, no money, no prospects to speak of, but he had an easy laugh and a good heart, and he had loved her plainly. For 5 good years, they had been happy together and poor together. They had counted the one a fair trade for the other. Then a hard winter came down on them. The fever came with it, sweeping through the cold streets. It took both her husband and the infant son she had borne him inside a single cruel month. She had buried them side by side in the frozen ground. Then she had gone on living because there was nothing else a body could do. The advertisement she had answered in the spring. She still had it with her, folded soft and small inside her glove. She had read it so many hundreds of times that the creases had worn nearly through. The words were plain, almost cold. A steady woman wanted, of good sense and sound health. Security offered, and a fine house, and a place in a respectable home. Of love, it said not a single word. Cara had read that absence and weighed it. Then she let herself fill it in with hope, the way a lonely heart always will. A man so careful with his promises, she had reasoned, would surely be careful in the keeping of them. Perhaps the warmth in him was only shy, she told herself. Perhaps it was buried and wanted only patience to bring it up. Perhaps a good marriage might grow from a plain beginning, the way a garden grows from bare brown ground. She had wanted, above all else, to belong to someone again, to have a roof that was hers and a name that was hers, to have a person across the table who was glad she was there. So she had packed her small trunk and spent her small savings on the fare. She had come west to be the wife of a man she had never once laid eyes on. At a lonely platform beneath the mountains, the train at last set her down. The station was no more than a wooden shed and a leaning sign with a name burned into it. A cold wind came down off the peaks and tugged at her bonnet. For a long moment she stood quite alone on the boards, her trunk beside her, her heart beating high in her throat. She looked about her for the man who was to be her husband. For a moment she feared no one had come at all. A tall figure waited by a wagon at the far end of the platform. He did not come forward to meet her. He only stood and watched her approach, still as a fence post, his face giving nothing back. Up close, he was tall indeed, hard built through the shoulders, iron gray at the temples. His flat, cool eyes moved over her, slow and careful. It was the way a man's eyes move over a horse led out for inspection. Not unkind, that look. Not warm either. Only measuring. She felt herself weighed in it and priced. She could not have said whether the sum came out to his liking. "Mrs. Fletch," he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," she managed, over the beating of her heart. "And you must be Mr. Dyer. Otis will do." He bent and lifted her trunk as though it weighed nothing at all. "Wagon's here. It's an hour out to the house. You'll want your coat about you. It comes cold off the mountains, even in summer." That was the whole of his welcome. There was no smile in it, and no warmth, and no glad word for a woman come 1,000 miles. She had pictured this moment 100 times on the long ride west. She had pictured many things. A shy man, perhaps, who would not meet her eye. A gruff one who would warm by the second day. A kind one even, against all hope, who would take her hand and say he was glad she had come. She had not pictured this cool and careful weighing as a man weighs a heifer at the rail. She put her own hopeful face away quietly, the way a woman folds a dress she will never wear. He handed her up onto the wagon seat, correct and impersonal, his eyes already on the team. Then he climbed up beside her and shook the reins. They rolled away from the little station into the great empty country. The ride out passed in near silence. Cara asked him gentle questions as they went, of the land, the weather, the work of the ranch. She did it partly to be friendly, partly to fill the vast quiet between them. He answered each question plainly and briefly, in as few words as the asking allowed. He offered nothing of his own. He did not ask her a single question in return. He did not ask after her journey, nor her people, nor the life she had left behind. The country rolled by them, grand and empty and gold. She had never felt so far from everything she knew, never so alone with another soul sitting close beside her. The house, when it rose at last against the mountains, was finer than she had dared to imagine. Squared timber and good gray stone, glass in every window, catching the last of the light, a wide porch facing the great peaks. A lesser woman, come west only for comfort, might have been gladdened to the heart by the sight of it. Cara looked at the fine, cold front of it, dark against the darkening sky. Without quite knowing why, she felt a small chill settle into her chest. It was a beautiful house. It did not look like a home. It looked like a thing a man had built to be looked at and not to be lived in. Supper was waiting when they came in. Laid by a hand Cara did not yet know. They ate it at opposite ends of a long table, in a dining room built for a large family that had never come. The food was good, plentiful, and well cooked. The silence between them was vast. Cara looked down the length of the polished table at the stranger she had agreed to marry. He looked at his plate. The candles burned between them, and no word passed for a long while. It was over that first cold supper that Otis Dyer laid out his terms. "You'll have understood the arrangement from my letter," he said, his voice even and unhurried. "I'll say it plain all the same, so there's no mistake between us. You'll keep my house and see it run well. In time, you'll give me an heir, God willing, and you'll want for nothing a body can buy." Cara set down her fork. The The small sound of it was loud in the quiet room. "And beyond that?" she asked. "Beyond that, nothing." He met her eyes across the table without a flicker. "I'm not a warm man, Mrs. Fletch. I'll not pretend to be one, and I'll not have you fooling yourself otherwise. You'll have my respect. You'll have my protection and a fair hand in all things, and that is no small thing in this world. But tenderness is not in me to give. Best you know it now plainly, and not go on hoping for what isn't there." The words landed in her quietly, one by one, like stones dropped into a still, dark pond. She had come west for a marriage and found a contract. She had come for a family and found a fine, cold house with a fine, cold man at the head of it. For a moment, the disappointment rose so sharply in her that she feared it might show on her face. She gathered herself, the way she had learned to gather herself over a grave. She thought of the husband and the child in the ground in Ohio. She thought of the long road that lay behind her now, all those miles, and she thought of the plain, hard fact that she had nowhere else on this earth to go. "I understand you," she said at last, steady enough. "I'll keep your house well, Mr. Dyer. You'll have no complaint of me." "Good," Otis said, and he went back to his supper. The matter was settled in his mind, as plainly as a tally of cattle entered in a book. That night, Cara lay alone in a fine, bare room, in a house with no warmth anywhere in it. She listened to the wind work along the eaves, a lonely sound in a lonely place. The grief she had thought long buried rose up fresh in the dark, as grief will. It came when a body was too tired and too far from home to hold it down. She wept for a little while, quietly, with the blanket pressed to her mouth. She did not want the cold man down the hall to hear her and think her weak. She wept for her Todd and for the baby, gone these 2 years. And she wept for the new family she could already feel slipping away, cold and out of reach, before it had even begun. Chapter 8. They were married within the week, and there was nothing of celebration in it. The town minister came out to the ranch on a Tuesday morning. He spoke the words over them in the front parlor. Garrett, the old foreman, stood witness, turning his hat slowly in his weathered hands. The whole of it was done before the noon meal. No guests came up the long road to wish them joy. No music played. No flowers stood upon the table, for it was not the season. Cara wore her best dress, the gray one. She held a small posy of nothing because her hands wanted something to hold. By the same afternoon, Otis had filed the marriage certificate among his deeds. He kept it in the locked drawer with his papers of worth. Then he pulled on his coat and rode out to sea to a broken stretch of fence. She had not looked for a wedding with bells and a white dress. She was a widow, past her first youth. She had buried her romantic notions in Ohio with her Todd, but she had hoped perhaps for some small mark of gladness, a toast, a kind word before the witness, a hand held a moment longer than it needed to be. There was none of it. There was a signature, a filed paper, and a man gone back to his fences before the ink was dry. So Cara Dyer began her married life as a wife in name and a housekeeper in every plain fact. The Bar D house was grand and comfortless, run like an outfit rather than a home. Cara moved through its cold rooms in those first days, learning their ways. She found a kitchen well stocked, a pantry full to the shelves, and good linen folded in the presses. She found fine things, bought with money and never once warmed by use. All of it was kept by a hired girl from town named Edie. She was a quiet, willing girl who came 3 days a week to scrub and wash. There was no want of anything in that house that a body could buy. There was only the want of warmth. That was the one thing wanting, and no money on earth could supply it. Her days took on a shape of a kind. She rose early and lit the fires. She cooked and cleaned and mended. She put up preserves against the winter. She learned the house room by room. She learned which boards creaked, which windows stuck, and where the cold came in. She set flowers on the table when there were flowers to be had. She aired the unused rooms, though no one used them. It was good work and honest. It kept her hands busy through the long days. It did not keep her heart busy. That was the trouble. A body could sweep a floor and grieve at the very same time. She did often both at once. At first, she set herself to thaw him. She tried it gently, in small ways, the way one coaxes a wary animal to the hand. A better supper laid with a pie to follow. a soft question about his day when he came in stamping from the cold, a warmth in her voice that asked for only a little warmth back. She was not a woman to give up easily, and she did not give up easily on him. Each kindness she offered, Otis received with the same wary courtesy. He took it up, looked at it, and set it carefully aside. It was the way a man hands back a gift he has decided he cannot accept. "You needn't trouble over the pie," he told her once, not unkindly. "Plain fare suits me well enough. I'd not have you wear yourself out on my account." "It's no trouble at all," Cara said. "I like to bake. It makes the place feel more like a home." A shadow crossed his face at the word, quick as a cloud over water, and was gone before she could read it. "The house is well enough as it is," he said. And that was the end of it. She watched him eat the pie all the same that night. He ate it slowly, and he ate every crumb. He did not praise it. He did not say a word, but he ate it as a hungry man eats, a man who has known what it is to go without. When his plate was clean, he sat a moment looking at it. Then he rose, thanked her stiffly, and went to his books. Cara cleared the plate and thought on it. He had said the pie was no matter. He had eaten it like it was. There was a man, she thought, who had taught himself not to want the sweet things. He could not always make the lesson hold. She did not weep over these small defeats. There were a good many of them, had she been the weeping kind. The warm word that met no answer. The chair drawn nearer that he did not draw nearer in turn. The 100 small reachings of a hand that closed on nothing. Each one was a small defeat. Each might have soured a lesser woman and turned her hard in her turn. Cara did not let it. She had wept enough her first night under his roof, and found it changed nothing. Tears were a poor tool for the work in front of her. So instead she watched, and she learned, and she went carefully. She crossed him, the way a woman crosses ice she is not sure will hold. She was a patient woman by nature, patient the way the poor learn to be. And she had begun to suspect a thing about her husband. He was a puzzle that would never yield to force. But he might, in time, yield to something gentler. The hands at least were kind to her. They tipped their hats when she crossed the yard. They thanked her, shy and rough, for the coffee she carried out on the cold, bright mornings. They asked after her health. They told her small jokes and grew red and pleased when she laughed. They were good men, most of them, hard-worked and far from their own mothers and sisters. A kind word from the mistress of the house meant something to such men. They had taken to the new mistress of the Bar D far more readily than the master ever did. Chief among them was Garrett Ford, the foreman. He was a bandy-legged old cowhand with white whiskers and shrewd, kindly eyes. They had seen a great deal of the world, those eyes, and forgiven most of it. For 20 years he had worked at Otis's side. He was, as far as Cara could tell, the one living creature her husband trusted at all. It was Garrett who first gave her any true word of the man she had married. "Don't take his coldness to heart, ma'am," the old foreman said one morning. He had found her standing troubled by the corral fence. "He's been just so the whole 20 years I've known him. It ain't you, and it ain't anything you've done. The man trusts cattle, and he trusts his ledgers, and not one living soul besides." "Has he no people?" Cara asked. "No family anywhere in the world?" "None that I ever heard tell of." Garrett scratched at his whiskers and looked off toward the mountains. "Came up from nothing, did Otis. Made every inch of this place himself, out of dirt and grit and his own 2 hands. And a man don't build a thing like the Bar D out of nothing without it costing him somewhere. Costs him deep, a thing like that. Just where it cost him, he's never once said, and I've never been fool enough to ask." "You're fond of him," Cara said. It was half a question. The old man's hands went still on the leather. 20 years I've rode for that man," he said at last. "He's hard, I'll not say he ain't, but he's fair and he's square. He never asked a hand to do a thing he wouldn't do himself in the wet and the cold. I've seen worse men loved by all the county, and I've seen better men I wouldn't cross the road for." He took up his awl again. "So yes, ma'am, I reckon I am, for whatever that's worth to a body." "He don't make it easy." "No," Cara said softly. "No, he does not." Cara turned that over in her mind a long while, after the old man had touched his hat and gone. A man does not build a thing like the Bar D out of nothing without it costing him somewhere. The words seemed to hold the whole shape of her husband, if only she could learn to read them. She had taken his coldness that first hard night for the simple absence of feeling, for a man born without a heart, as some men seemed to be. Now she was not so certain. A man born without a heart did not flinch, however slightly, at the word home, for now and again she caught it, the flinch behind the flat gray stare. It was a small thing, a flicker, there and then gone, quickly shuttered away. It came when she spoke of warm things, of children, of homes, of the small kindnesses that pass between people who love one another. Each time she saw something in him draw back and bar a door. He barred it the way a man bars a door against a cold he remembers too well and means never to feel again. She began slowly to wonder whether the ice was not the truth of him at all. Perhaps the coldness was not the absence of feeling, she thought. Perhaps it was a wall built up over far too much of it. Behind that flat gray gaze, there might be a great deal a man was hiding, a great deal he had buried so deep and so long ago that he had nearly forgotten it was there. She did not know. She could not yet know. But the more she watched him, the surer she grew. There was something underneath the cold, and the cold was there to guard it. The thought did not warm her marriage, not yet, but it kindled in her something better than warmth for the moment. It kindled her curiosity, first of all. And underneath the curiosity, against all her good sense, it kindled the first faint stirrings of her compassion. A wounded creature she had always found was one she could not help but want to tend. And she was beginning to believe, though she could not yet have proved it, that she had married one. Chapter 9. The first true crack in the ice came to Cara by accident, near midnight in the barn. A cow had been laboring since dusk with a calf turned wrong inside her. It was a cold, clear night, with fall coming on. The stars stood sharp as chips of ice over the black shapes of the mountains. There was a new bite in the air, the first real chill of the turning season. It was no night to be out. It was no night, Cara thought, for a calf to come. Cara knew nothing of it at first. She knew only that the supper had gone cold on the table. It had waited for a husband who never came in to eat it. The hour grew late. The lamp burned low. At last, worry drove her out across the dark yard, a shawl caught about her shoulders. She wanted to see whether some trouble was keeping him. A lantern burned low and yellow in the great barn, the one light in all the sleeping dark. Toward it she went, quietly on the trampled earth, her breath smoking before her. What she saw through the half-open door stopped her where she stood. Otis knelt in the straw, his coat thrown off and his sleeves rolled past the elbow. His arms were slick and bare to the shoulder. The downed cow lay heaving on her side beside him, her eyes rolling white with the pain. He was working to turn the calf within her, his arm deep in the great laboring body, slow and sure and infinitely careful. And all the while he was talking to her, not as Cara had ever once heard him talk, low and gentle, a steady murmur of comfort. It was the way a mother might speak to a frightened child in the dark. "Easy now, old girl. Easy. I have you. We'll see it through together, you and I. There, now, there." Cara hardly dared to breathe, for fear of breaking the strange spell of it. Gone was the cold master of the Bardee, vanished, as though he had never been. In his place knelt a man she had never met. He was tender past anything she could have guessed at across that long, silent supper table. Over a dumb and suffering beast, he poured out a gentleness he had never once turned upon a person. His hard hands, the hands that had set 10,000 fence posts, moved now with a patience that was almost love. His low voice never faltered, never hardened. The calf came free at last in a rush, wet and steaming in the cold barn air, and a tenderness eased and opened in his weathered face. She had never seen it there before. She had not known his face could hold it. Then the calf shook its small, wet head and drew its first shuddering breath. And Otis laughed. It was quiet, that laugh, and rough from long disuse. The man had near forgotten how it was done, but it was real. There was no mistaking it for anything but joy. It lit his hard-weathered face for one unguarded moment. It smoothed the years from it and made him almost young again. Cara stood in the dark beyond the lantern light and felt her heart turn clean over. This, then, this was what the cold had been hiding all along. She must have made some small sound, some catch of breath, for his head came up sharp. The warmth shut off his face on the instant, the way a lamp is shut off. He rose to his feet, wiping his arms on a rag. The cold gray mask came down again, so fast and so complete that she might have dreamed the other man beneath it. He looked for one strange moment, almost ashamed. He looked the way a man looks who has been caught at something private, not meant to be seen. He would not quite meet her eyes. "It's late," he said, his voice flat once more, the warmth gone out of it. "You shouldn't be out in the cold. Go on back to the house now." "The calf," Cara said softly from the doorway. "It lives? It lives. Go on now." For a moment she did not go. She stood in the doorway and looked at him, and he looked back. Something hung in the cold air between them that neither would name. The calf bawled, thin and new. The cow heaved herself up and turned to it. Otis's eyes went to the pair of them, soft for half a breath. Then he caught himself and turned away. "Good night, then," Cara said. "Good night," he said to the straw, to the cow, to anything but her. She went, but she carried the sight of it back with her, across the dark yard, into the cold house, up to her lonely bed. It would not leave her. Sleep was a long time coming. She lay and watched the dark and saw it over again. The bare arms, the bowed head, the low, kind voice she had not known he owned. She had married a block of winter ice, she had thought. She had been wrong. Under the ice ran water, and the water was warm. It had only frozen over because something once had taught it that warmth was not safe to show. All his hoarded tenderness, she understood now, had been driven down out of sight. It had not died in him. That was what she had learned, kneeling in spirit beside him in that barn. It was not gone. It had only been buried alive, pushed down out of the light, down into the dumb beasts and the newborn calves, into the creatures that could never reject it, never use it against him, never make him sorry he had let it show. A man did not learn such a strange and lonely habit without cause. Somewhere, sometime, the cost that Garrett had spoken of had been paid. It had been paid in just that coin. She did not yet know where or when or by whom, but she knew now, past doubting, that it had. She rose the next morning and looked at him over the breakfast table with new eyes. He ate his eggs, he read his paper, he said his few flat words and went out to his work. To any other eye, he was the same cold man as ever. But she had seen behind the curtain now, and she could not unsee it. She watched his hard hands around the coffee cup. She thought of how gentle they had been with the cow. She found she could not stop watching. After that night, she began to find the man beneath the master in small, unguarded glimpses. His dry wit when he forgot himself and let it slip. Sharp and quiet, surprising as a stone underfoot. His scrupulous fairness to the hands who would have walked through fire for him, though he never asked it. The way he could not abide cruelty to a horse, not in any form. He had once turned a man off the place on the spot for it, she learned. It was the only time in 20 long years that Garrett had seen the master raise his voice. She watched for these signs now, the way a body watches for the first green at winter's end. She marked how he gentled a green colt, all patience and low words. She marked how he carried a sick lamb in by the fire and sat up with it. She marked the books on his shelf, well-worn, read and read again. A man teaching himself by lamplight what no school had ever taught him. She marked the quiet, careful way he had with anything young or hurt or weak. Piece by piece, she gathered him up, this hidden husband of hers. And against her own will, against every caution she set herself, she found herself drawn to the man she was uncovering. And yet the more she felt the pull of him, the more it wounded her to know her place. For Cara had not failed to mark the plain truth of things. She was valued in that house, yes, but she was valued as the cow in the barn was valued, and no more. She was a sound investment, a good wife who kept a good house and would, in time, produce the heir that was wanted of her, the way a good cow produces a calf. Otis treated her well, as he treated all his holdings well, because a wise man tends what is his. She could not fault his care. She could only grieve what it was not, for being well tended was not the same as being wanted. And it was a long, bleak way from being loved. She had come west aching to belong to someone. She had found herself, in the end, merely employed. It was a strange thing to be lonely in a marriage. She had not known it could be done. With Todd, She had been poor and crowded and often tired, but never once lonely. There had always been a hand to hold in the dark. There had always been a face glad to see hers. Here, there was none of that. Here, there was a fine, wide bed in a fine, cold room, and no one in it but herself. Here, there was a husband who slept down the hall and might as well have slept across an ocean. She had thought the worst loneliness came of having no one. She was learning a worse kind. It was the loneliness of having someone, just out of reach, who would not let you near. The knowing of it sat heavy on her as the weeks wore on into months. She would catch herself watching for him at the close of the day, glad of his step at the door. Then she would remember herself and remember her place. His gladness at the sight of her, if he felt any, was only the satisfaction of a man whose property is sound, a man whose accounts are in order. Lying awake in her fine, bare room, with the wind at the eaves, she wondered bitterly. Had she not simply traded one loneliness for another, and a poorer one at that? She had married a good house and a cold bargain, and a man who would not let her near. And in the small hours it seemed she had done nothing in coming west. Nothing but marry her own old grief all over again. Chapter 10. The terms had named an heir, and it was the heir in the end that Cara could not reconcile. It had seemed simple enough, set down in a letter, read 1,000 miles away. In time, you'll give me an heir. She had read the words and not flinched from them. She had wanted children all her life. What was strange, she had thought, in a man wanting the same? But a thing can read one way on paper and another across a cold supper table. She had not understood until she came what manner of child he meant. She understood it now. She had lost a child of her own. The small grave in Ohio had taught her in the hardest school there is what a child was worth. It had taught her what one cost to lose. She had held her own son in her arms, warm and breathing. She had laid him cold in the ground inside a single winter. She knew the weight of a child. She knew the price. And now a man wanted her to bear another, only so that he might have something to leave his land to when he died. That seemed to her a wrong she could not come to. A child got like a calf, raised up to inherit a brand and nothing warmer. The thought sat ill in her and would not be argued down. One evening, gathering her courage, she tried to speak of it to him. "Otis," she said, when the supper things were cleared and the lamp lit low, "when you wrote of an heir, in your letter, did you ever once think of the child himself, of what he would be to us apart from the land?" His face closed like a door swinging shut. "A son carries the place on. That's what a son is for." "That is what a son is to you," she said gently, careful not to make it a quarrel. "I am asking what he would be. A child wants loving, Otis. He wants it more than bread, not just feeding and schooling and a brand to grow into. Loving, plain loving, for no reason but himself." "He'd want for nothing," Otis said. "He'd have more than I ever—" The sentence stopped short in his mouth. Some gate slammed shut behind his eyes. It shut off whatever had been about to come through. He'd have a sound home, good food, good schooling, and land at the end of it. That's more than most get in this world. "A sound home is not the same as a loved one," she said. "It's enough." His tone forbade another word on it. "It'll have to be." She looked at him for a long moment across the lamp. There was no cruelty in his face. That was the worst of it. There was no anger, no scorn, nothing she could push against. There was only a flat certainty, settled deep. A sound home was the most a child could ask, and the most a man could give. He believed it. He believed it the way he believed in fences and weather, and a body could not argue a man out of a thing he had learned in his own bones. She let the silence come back. It was easier than the words. She let it lie there at the lamplit table. But she saw it now, plainly, and could not unsee it. He meant to want a son the way he wanted a sound bull, for the line of it, and not for the love. He meant to raise a child the way he ran the ranch, with fairness and good provision, and not 1 ounce of tenderness. Tenderness was a thing he did not have to give, and she knew just as plainly that she could not give him a child on those terms. Not that child, not one raised cold in a loveless house to be a man's possession and his heir, and never once his heart's delight. The refusal of her own deepest wish hardened a resolve in Cara, too. For she did want a child. God help her, she wanted one with her whole aching heart. She had wanted one every single day since the fever took her own. It was an emptiness in her arms that no work could fill. She felt it most in the small hours. She felt it when she passed the empty rooms. She felt it when she heard on the wind some far-off child laughing down in the valley. Her body remembered the weight it had carried and lost. It did not forget. It would not let her forget. To have the chance set before her now and find she could not take it, not in this house, not on these cold terms. It was a grief laid over a grief. It was the old wound and a new one together. A careful, brittle distance settled between her and her husband after that night. They were courteous still. They were always courteous. He passed her the salt. She filled his cup. They spoke of the weather and the stock and the small business of the day. But a door had quietly shut between them. Both of them felt it shut, and neither knew how to open it again. He went earlier to his books in the evening. She went earlier to her bed. The house grew quieter even than before, if such a thing were possible. Each of them walled away alone, each nursing a private hurt the other could not see. It was Garrett again who gave her the next small key to it. She found the old foreman mending tack in the lee of the barn one gray afternoon, out of the wind. She sat down on an upturned crate beside him and stayed a while. She was glad of the only easy company the place afforded her. They spoke of small things, the weather and the stock and the coming of winter. Then, in a lull, she asked him the question that had been growing in her. "Garrett, you said once that the Bardee cost Otis somewhere. Do you know where?" The old man worked his awl slowly through the leather a moment before he answered. "Not the whole of it, ma'am. He don't tell, and I've never been one to pry. But I know this much. I know he came up an orphan. No people at all, not a one. Worked as a boy on some hard prairie farm back east of here, before ever he came west and made himself." "An orphan," Cara said softly. The word went into her and stayed. She thought of a small boy, somewhere, alone. She thought of him cold and hungry and unwanted. She thought of him grown into the hard man who would not eat her pie before her face and ate it after. An ache rose in her chest at the picture of it. Hard used, by the little he's let slip over the years. A word here, a word there, mostly when he's tired. Worked like a grown man before he was rightly half grown. Never had a single soul to call his own, he told me once. Not till he up and made his own way in the world. Garrett shook his white head slowly over the leather. "Said it flat, mind. Said it like he was telling me the weather. But a thing like that marks a man, ma'am. It marks him deep. It marks him whether he'll ever own to it or no." Cara carried the old man's words back into the house and turned them over half the night. An orphan. Hard used, never a soul to call his own. A boy worked like a man before his time. Grown up at last to trust cattle and ledgers and not one living person. She lay in the dark of her lonely room and let the pieces of him fall together, one against another, and the cold man she had married began at last to make a terrible kind of sense. A child never once chosen, learned in time not to hope to be. So it had been with Otis. A child wanted only for his work grew into a man who believed that work was the whole of his worth. A boy never kept for his own dear sake built high walls around himself, stone on stone. And he kept only land behind those walls, only acres and cattle and goods that could be owned. For land could not leave a man, land could not fail to love him back, because it was never asked to love him at all. The coldness was not cruelty, she saw now. It had never been cruelty. It was armor. Armor forged on some bleak, far-off farm 30 years gone, hammered out by people who had taken in a child for the strength of his hands and never once for the love of his heart. The understanding did not mend her marriage, not by itself, not yet, but it changed the whole shape of it in her own mind, and that was no small thing. She had thought herself wed to a hard man, a cold one, a closed one, a man who simply had no warmth to give. She saw now that she was wed instead to a wounded one, and the two were not the same at all. They were not even close. A hard man you might in time give up on and harden yourself against in turn, but a wounded one, a body wanted only to gather up and hold and tend until the hurt was eased. She turned onto her side and looked at the dark wall and let herself feel the whole of it. The anger first, Then, beneath the anger, the pity. And beneath the pity, deeper still, a thing she had no business feeling, not for a man who had bought her like a heifer and told her plainly to expect no love. She had come to this house emptied out, sure she had nothing left to give. She found she had been wrong about that too. And lying there in the dark, Cara felt the last of her anger give way. It went against all her good sense and all her own fresh hurt. It softened into something far more dangerous to her own hard-won peace. It softened, in the quiet of that long night, into tenderness. Chapter 11. Word of the orphan train reached the valley on a bright morning in early fall. Cara heard it first from Edie, who heard everything first. The girl came in from town with her basket and her news, breathless with the carrying of both. The rails ran clear to the railhead now, she said. A train was coming up from the east, all the way from the great cities. A whole carload of orphan children was aboard. They were to be placed among the Montana families, the way such children had long been placed, handed down from the cars to whoever would take them. Edie told it the way she told everything, half wonder and half gossip, while she hung her shawl and tied her apron. Cara listened and set down the bread she was kneading and did not pick it up again for a while. An orphan train. She had heard of such things, of course. Everyone had. The great cities of the East were full to bursting with children no one could feed. The churches gathered them up and scrubbed them and sent them west on the rails. They sent them to the wide, empty country where hands were always wanted and homes might be found. It was called a mercy, and perhaps it was one. A roof was a roof. A full belly was a full belly. But Cara's own heart turned over at the thought of it. All those small ones, packed into a swaying car, tagged like parcels, rolling toward strangers who would look them over and choose or not choose. To be a child and to be chosen for your usefulness. To know yourself wanted only for your hands. It was a bitter way to come into a family. It was, she thought, a bitter way to come into the world. The whole town took fire with the talk of it. In the store and at the church door, folk weighed the matter aloud. A widow allowed she could use a girl to help in the kitchen. Now her own were grown and gone. A rancher thought a strong boy might earn his keep in the yard and cost less than a hired hand. The talk ran to ages and to teeth and to willing backs. It was the way talk runs when people are choosing stock. Some meant well by it in their fashion. A child with a roof was better than a child without one, and most knew it. But few of them spoke of the children themselves. Few wondered what those children might be feeling, rolling west toward strangers. Most spoke only of the use that might be got from them, of the price of their keep and whether a placed child paid its way. Cara listened to all of it, and a longing stirred in her that she could not still. Somewhere on that train, she thought, there might be a child, a real child, a child with a face and a name and a hurt all his own. Not the cold air of her husband's letter, got like a calf for the sake of a brand. A true child, who needed a mother as badly as she needed to be one. Her arms had ached empty for 2 long years now. She had carried that emptiness west with her, and it had not eased in this cold house. It had grown. And now the thought of a little one rose up in her of a sudden, a little one to love, to raise, to keep and warm and call her own. So strong and so sudden it came that it frightened her. She knew the terms of her marriage. She had not forgotten them. She turned the notion over carefully all that day as she worked. An heir Otis had wanted, got cold and got for his land, that she could not give him and would not. But this was a different thing. Surely it was a different thing. A placed child was not an heir bargained for. It was a rescue. It was a gift freely given to one who had nothing and no one. A man might want a son for his brand and call it business, but to take in a friendless child off a train, to give a lost one a home, that was no business. That was mercy, plain and simple. Surely she let herself hope even her cold husband might be moved by a thing like that. He could not abide cruelty to a horse. How then could he turn away a child? All that day the thought would not leave her be. More than once she stopped at her work, the spoon idle in the bowl, gazing at nothing. She pictured a child at the long, empty table. She pictured small boots by the door and a coat too short in the arm. She pictured the sound of running feet on the stairs of the silent house. She pictured herself bending to a scraped knee. She pictured a face turned up to hers, trusting the way a child's face turns up to its mother. In her empty arms lived the memory of a child's weight. Her whole body leaned toward it, all that long day, the way a plant leans toward a window. That evening, she carried the notion to the supper table, careful as a woman carrying a brimful pail. She waited until the meal was nearly done, and his temper at its easiest. She chose her words on the way, and chose them again, and tried to make them light. "There's a train coming," she said, "an orphan train, up to the railhead. They mean to place the children among the families hereabouts." Otis said nothing. He went on eating, his eyes on his plate. "I thought," Cara pressed gently, "that we might go and see, only see. We've room enough in this great house and means enough, and more to spare. There's more love going to waste under this roof than either of us will own to. A child who has no one. A child who... No." The word fell flat and hard between them. He had not raised his voice. He had not needed to. He set the fork down with a care that was somehow worse than temper, laying it square beside his plate. When he lifted his eyes to her, his face had gone shut and gray. A door swung closed and bolted. "It's no concern of ours," he said. "That train, those children. Put it from your mind, Cara." Cara studied him, taken aback by the suddenness of it. "Otis, they're children with no one in the world. Surely we, of all people, with all we have." "I said put it from your mind." Something moved behind the flat gray eyes, quick and dark. It was there and gone again before she could read the shape of it. "There'll be no more talk of it in this house. Do you hear me? None." She heard him. She could hardly do otherwise. For a long moment she did not move. The lamp hissed softly between them. His meal sat half-eaten before him, and hers before her, and the silence rang in her ears. She had asked for so little, she thought. Not a child got and kept against his wishes, only to go and look, only to consider it. And he had shut her down as he might shut a gate, hard and final, and with that strange dark thing underneath. Never once in their short marriage had he spoken to her so. Not cold, the way he was always cold. This was something else, something with an edge underneath it, a strange cold heat she had never felt off him before. It frightened her a little. She fell silent, and he rose from the table, though his plate was not yet clean, a thing she had never known him to do. He took up his hat and went out into the falling dusk without another word. Cara sat alone a long while in the lamplight, turning the strangeness of it over. The door closed. His step crossed the porch and faded toward the barn. The supper cooled on the table before her, his and hers both, and she made no move to clear it. Anger she had expected, perhaps, when she raised it, or his usual flat, immovable refusal, the wall she had met 100 times. This was neither of those. There had been something else underneath his voice, a note she had no name for, one that did not fit the man at all. If she had not known better, she would have said it sounded almost like fear. But what could a man like Otis Dyer fear from a carload of friendless children? The notion made no sense to her, turn it how she would. He feared nothing she had ever seen. Not weather, not loss, not the hardest man in the county. He had stared down bankers and blizzards and never blinked. And yet at the word of a train full of orphans, he had gone gray. He had risen from his own table and fled his own house into the dark. There was a riddle in it she could not solve, alone with the cold plates and the guttering lamp. She rose at last and cleared the table, slow, her mind far away. The plates she scraped, the fire she banked, the lamp she turned down low. Through the window, a light showed in the barn where her husband had gone. He would sit out there in the cold, she knew, until he was sure she had taken to her bed. That was his way when a thing troubled him past bearing. He went to the animals. Once she had thought it only a hard man's preference, the company of beasts over the company of his wife. Now she wondered if it was something else. Perhaps there were things he could not bear to feel inside the warm house where a person might see them on his face. To her bed she did not go straight away. A while she stood at the window, watching the far yellow light. She thought of the boy or girl who might be on that train, and she thought of her husband, out in the dark, fleeing a thing she could not name. She could not know what she was looking at. She could not have guessed that the train rolling toward their town carried more than a dozen lost children. It carried something else besides. It carried her husband's whole buried past. It was coming back over 30 years and 1,000 miles, coming to meet him at last, on the very kind of platform where it had begun. Chapter 12. The train came in on a bright, raw morning, and half the county came in with it. Cara went too. She could not have stayed away to save her life. A pull drew her down to that platform, past all her good sense, past her husband's cold command of the night before. She had lain awake on it. She had told herself to let it be, to mind the terms of her marriage, and put the train from her mind as he had bid her. And in the morning, she had put on her good bonnet and gone all the same. To look was all she meant to do, or so she told herself. Even as she told it, she did not quite believe it. There was an ache in her arms that did not care for sense. To her surprise, Otis came as well. He said no word of why. He had been against the whole business, hard against it, only the night before. Yet in the morning, he hitched the team in silence and handed her up onto the seat. He drove the long road into town with his jaw set like gray stone. His eyes were fixed on the road ahead. Cara did not dare to ask him why he came. She only watched the side of his hard face and wondered. At the meeting house, he did not go forward into the crowd. He stood at the back instead, well back, his hat pulled low and his shoulders squared. He had the look of a man braced against a blow he would not name, a man standing his ground before something he dreaded. Cara left him to it. She moved up nearer the front, where the families gathered, drawn despite herself toward the children. A young woman had charge of them. She was brisk and neat and travel-worn, with a ledger carried under one arm. She had the tired, steady look of someone long at thankless work. Miss Francine Wise, she gave her name to the gathered families. She was the placing agent, she told them. She had come the whole long way west with the children to find them homes among good Christian people. One by one, she handed them down from the cars. One by one, she ranged them along the platform, in a row for all to see. She smoothed a collar here, murmured a low word of encouragement there. She had done it many times before. It showed in the weary gentleness of her hands. Cara warmed to the young woman at once, watching her work. There was kindness in her, under the briskness. She crouched to speak to the little ones at their own height. She tucked a loose curl behind a small ear. She told each child, low, to stand straight and not to fret. She gave each one a squeeze of the hand before she let it go. It was a grim trade she plied, Cara thought, to gather up the cast-off children of the cities, to carry them across a continent, to stand them up to be chosen or not chosen by strangers. A body would need a strong heart for such work. A body would need to harden some part of herself or break. Cara wondered which the young woman had done, and guessed it was a little of both. The children stood in a row for the families to look over. There were perhaps a dozen of them, scrubbed and tagged and blinking in the bright mountain light. They wore their best, which was no great thing. Donated coats and mended stockings, all of it a size too big or a size too small. Their faces were washed pink. Their hair was combed flat with water. They had been made as pleasing as the agent could make them, for pleasing was the whole of their hope. The small ones clutched at the hands of the bigger ones. Frightened, not understanding, knowing only that something was about to happen to them and that they had no say in it. The families pressed close to inspect them, and the old, terrible commerce began again. It was the same that had played out 30 years before in a Missouri town. The weighing of a child by the strength of his arms and the soundness of his teeth. Cara watched it with an ache rising sharp in her throat. She had thought she understood what she came to see. She had not known it would be so hard to watch. Then her eye found the boy at the end of the line, and her breath caught. He stood a little apart from the rest, as though he had set himself there and did not mind it. 11, he looked, perhaps 12. Thin and wiry, all sharp angles and wary stillness. Scabbed knuckles and a jaw held too tight for a child his age. He did not clutch at anyone. There was no one to clutch at, and he wanted none. He did not smile for the families the way the little ones were coaxed to smile. He did not plead with his eyes. He only stood and stared out at the crowd with a flat, hard defiance. It all but dared them to come close, dared them to find him wanting. The sight of him struck Cara to the bone, though she could not say why. It was not pity, exactly, though there was pity in it. It was a strange jolt of knowing, as though she had seen the boy before. She had not. She was certain she had not. And yet the look of him pulled at something in her, some thread that ran she knew not where. She stood and stared at the hard-faced boy. The feeling grew, and she could not account for it at all. Beside her, of a sudden, she felt her husband go rigid. She had not heard him come up, but he was there now, close behind her shoulder. The change in him was so great that she felt it through the very air. She turned to look at him, and what she saw there frightened her badly. Gray to the lips, he had gone. His flat eyes were fixed on the boy at the end of the line, fixed and unblinking. The child might have been a ghost risen up out of the cold ground before him. One hand had closed white-knuckled on the brim of the hat he held. He was not breathing, or near enough to it. Every hard line of him had gone still as struck stone. She had never seen him so, not in all their months. She had not known he could look so. "Otis?" she said softly, alarmed. "What is it? What's wrong?" He did not answer her. He did not seem to hear her voice at all. He had gone somewhere she could not follow, somewhere far back and far down. The boy on the platform had taken him there, for the sight of the boy had hit Otis Dyer like a fist driven clean into his chest. He had known the train was coming. He had known the children would be lined up just so. That was the very reason he had forbidden Cara the night before, and the reason he had come this morning, all the same, drawn against his own will. He had told himself he only meant to stand at the back and see it done, to prove once and for all that it had no hold on him. He had been wrong. The hold was total. One look down that line of scrubbed and waiting faces, and the thing he had buried 30 years deep came clawing up out of the ground. It was himself. It was himself, 30 years gone. Standing on just such a platform, in just such a ragged line, thin and raw-boned and braced for the worst. The same defiant jaw, set against the tears, the same flat refusal to beg, to please, to make himself soft and biddable for the choosing, the same wary, friendless stare he had worn himself. He had worn it the very day the Craws walked up and pried open his mouth to count his teeth. He had buried that boy on a long drive north and never once gone back for him. He had spoken of him to no one in 30 years. He had near forgotten on the good days that the boy had ever been. And here the child stood now, alive, breathing, flesh and bone in the morning light, waiting on the kindness of strangers, exactly as Otis had once waited and waited and waited in vain. The years fell away beneath him like a rotten floor. No longer was he the master of the Bar D. He was a boy with a tag pinned to his coat, and no one coming, and no one ever going to come. He could feel the old straw under him. He could smell the cold barn and the leather of the belt. He could taste the shame of the smiling until his face cracked, the begging without words for someone, anyone, to choose him. All of it came back at once, in a single cruel flood, called up by the sight of a thin boy in a donated coat. 30 years he had spent building walls against this very memory. 30 years of land and cattle and cold. And it had taken only one boy on one platform to bring the whole of it down on his head. Cara knew none of this, but she followed her husband's stricken stare to the defiant boy, then back again to his gray and stricken face. And something in the matched set of their two jaws told her a thing before she rightly knew how she knew it. It told her plain without a word, the secret he had carried locked in him the whole of their marriage. She did not have the whole of it. She could not. But she had the shape of it now, and the shape was enough to take her breath. The boy on the platform was her husband, made young again, and set out for strangers to pass by. And her husband, standing gray and stricken at her side, was that same boy grown old. He looked on at his own ruin and could not lift a hand. She was looking at one wound. She was only seeing it twice. Chapter 13. One by one, the little ones were chosen, and the boy at the end of the line was not. It went the way it always went, the way it had gone 30 years before, and would go again as long as there were trains and orphans to ride them. The small, soft, pretty children were lifted up, cooed over, and led away by the hand. A fair little girl went to the widow from the church. She had wanted a girl for the kitchen and found her heart caught instead. A round-faced boy of 4 went to a rancher's wife, who wept to hold him, having buried 2 of her own. The crowd thinned slowly as the children were gathered, one and then another, carried off into new lives. The morning wore on toward noon, and still the hard-eyed boy stood alone upon the platform, at the end of the row, passed over and passed over again. Ray, the agent, called him. Cara caught the name as it was spoken, and kept it, and held it close. He did not plead as the others had been coaxed to plead. He kept his chin up and his eyes flat while the families passed him by. He did not smile. He did not soften. Now and again one of the lookers would pause before him. He would run an eye over the boy and move on at the sight of that wary, defiant face. He was too old, the look of them said. He was too hard. He was trouble, plain as paint. No one came west to a meeting house looking for trouble. The boy seemed to know all of it. He wore it the way he wore his ragged coat. He had the look of a child who has been passed over before, more than once, and has stopped expecting anything else. It was not the being passed over that caught at Cara, watching him. It was the not expecting otherwise. A small child cried, reached, and hoped because a small child did not yet know better. This boy had learned better. He had learned it young and learned it bitter. He stood with his chin up and his eyes flat and asked for nothing. Asking had taught him only that asking went unanswered. He had the face of a child who had given up on being wanted. He had made his peace with it, the way the old make their peace with dying. Cara's heart broke clean across at the sight of him. The old ache rose in her until she could scarcely draw breath. Here was the child of her hope. The real child, the one with a face and a name and a hurt all his own. And no one would have him. No one would so much as smile at him. She turned to her husband, the plea already rising on her lips. She was ready to beg him there and then to take this one home. Terms be hanged. Bargain be hanged. What she found stopped the words cold in her throat. Otis stood gray-faced and rooted to the spot, his eyes locked on the boy. He seemed unable to move or to speak or to look away. Then a man and his wife stepped forward toward the boy, and Cara's blood ran cold. She knew them by sight, as everyone in the valley knew them. Silas Shawshank and his wife Gretchen, who farmed a hard, mean place across the valley. Lean and sour was Silas, tight-fisted as a closed trap. He had cold, pale eyes. He had a name all through the country for working his hired hands to the bone and paying them next to nothing. Men did not stay long at the Shawshank place. The ones who did came away gaunt. He came up now to the boy and looked him over, slow. He looked the way a man eyes a young ox he means to put to the plow and work till it drops. "Strong enough, I reckon," Silas said. He took the boy's thin arm in his hand and felt the muscle of it, squeezing, judging. "Bit old, this one, but he'll work, and he won't eat near as much as a grown hand would. He'll do for the chores," Gretchen allowed, thin-lipped, at his shoulder. The boy said nothing. He stood still and let the man feel his arm. He had no doubt learned to stand still and let himself be handled. But his flat eyes moved once, quick, to the cold faces of the pair who would own him. He took their measure in a glance, and whatever he saw there, he did not flinch from it, nor plead against it. He only set his jaw a little harder and looked away, off toward the mountains. He had the look of a boy who has long since learned that what he wants has no bearing on what he gets. They wanted a back, not a boy. Cara saw it plainly, and so did everyone who watched. There was no warmth in either hard face. There was no thought of the child himself, of what he might feel, of what might become of him. There was only the cold reckoning of labor to be had, weighed against the price of his keep, and the sum came out in their favor. It was the worst of all the morning's cruel commerce, the very bottom of it, laid bare for any eye that cared to see. A boy nobody wanted, going to people who wanted only his hands. And it was the craws come again. It was the whole of it come round again. It was the barn and the belt and the cold suppers on the step. It was the long years of labor that bought a child nothing. It was the whole of Otis's lost boyhood about to be lived over again, by a child who was his very mirror, while Otis stood and watched. Otis knew it. He knew it in his bones, in his blood, in the old white scars hidden under his good shirt. One word from him would have ended it. Only one. He was the richest man in the county and the most feared. A word from Otis Dyer carried weight that no Shawshank could stand against. One word, and the boy would have come to the Bar D instead. To warmth, to plenty, to a clean bed and a full plate and a fair chance at a whole different life. The word was there in him. He felt it rise up his throat, urgent, demanding. Stop. I'll take him. The boy comes with me. A line of small words. He had said harder things to harder men 100 times. They waited on his tongue, but the past had him by the throat, and it would not let the word out. He stood and he fought it. No one watching could have seen the fight, for it was all inside him, behind the gray, still mask of his face. But it raged there all the same. The man he was wished to speak. The boy he had been would not let him. The boy knew what that platform was. The boy knew the cost of hoping, and the worst cost of being seen to hope. He had clamped down on it so hard and so long ago that the grown man could not pry the grip loose now, not even to save a child. To look at the boy was to be 10 years old again, thin and friendless on a platform, smiling until his face cracked, passed over all the same. To open his mouth and speak for the child was to reach back into all that buried hurt with his own bare hands, to take hold of it and drag it up into the light. He could not do it. God help him. He could not. The horror of it held him fast. He stood frozen and silent while the long moment stretched and thinned to breaking. He let it pass, and he hated himself bitterly, savagely, even in the very moment of doing it. Beside him, Cara waited for her husband to speak, and her husband did not speak. She looked about her at the crowd, half wild with it. Surely someone would speak. Surely in all these good church-going people, one soul would step forward and say the thing that wanted saying. But no one did. They watched the Shawshanks take the boy the way folk watch any small grim thing they would rather not look at too close. A few looked sorry. None looked sorry enough to act. And her own husband stood graver and stiller than any, the richest and strongest man among them, the one man who could have ended it with a word. She could not understand it. She could make no sense of it at all. Here was a man who could not abide cruelty to a dumb beast, a man who had turned a hand off the place for laying a hard hand on a horse. And yet he stood still as stone, gray and silent, while a living child was handed over to the likes of the Shawshanks. She looked from her husband's stricken silence to the boy's flat, hopeless face and back again, and something in her began to turn. It turned from confusion toward a slow and rising anger, an anger she did not yet have anywhere to put. If her husband would not speak, she thought, then she would speak herself. She drew her breath. She opened her mouth to do it, terms or no terms, his command of the night before or no. But she was a moment too late, and a lifetime too cautious. The agent's pen was already moving across the page. The bleak morning was already closing over the boy like cold water over a stone. And the chance for that day was slipping past them all. Past Cara, past the frozen man beside her, past the hard-eyed boy who had never once expected it would not. Chapter 14. The boy was not signed over that day in the end. Some matter of papers stood unfinished, some form not filled, some signature wanting. The agent would not complete the placement until the morrow, when it could be done properly. The Shawshanks went off home across the valley, well pleased, to ready a place for their new hand. A corner of the barn, no doubt, and a list of chores. The boy was kept overnight at the meeting house in Miss Webb's care. And the Dyers drove the long road home in a silence so deep it might have cracked the very air between them. She held her tongue the whole long ride. She held it past the town, past the river crossing, past the turn that led up to the Bar D. She held it because she did not trust herself to speak it gently, and because the look on her husband's face forbade speaking at all. But a thing held too long and too hard will break its banks in the end. She could hold it no longer once they were home, the team unhitched, the door shut behind them. She had meant to be gentle. She had meant to reason with him, calm and low, the way one reasons with a balky horse. But the day had worn her thin. The sight of him standing there cold and unmoved burned the calm clean out of her. Otis. She found him in the front room, staring into a cold hearth into a fire he had not troubled to light. "We have to go back tomorrow. Before they sign him over to those people, we have to take that boy. We're taking no one." He did not turn from the dark hearth. "Don't say it like that. Don't say it like he's a head of stock you've decided against." She came around to face him. "He's a child, Otis, a boy, and those people will grind him to nothing, and you know it better than anyone in this valley." "I know what I know." His voice did not rise. "And I know we'll not be taking him. That's the end of it." "It is not the end of it. It cannot be the end of it. You saw him. You saw the Shawshanks, the both of them. You know better than anyone what kind of place that is." Her voice shook with the force of holding it steady. "They'll work him like a mule. They'll never give him a kind word as long as he lives. We have room, Otis. We have everything a child could need and more, and it all going to waste. Why won't you? Because I'll not have some half-grown stranger under my roof." He turned then at last, and his face was a hard gray mask. "We didn't bargain for a boy off a train, you and I. That was no part of it. I'm no man's father. I never will be. Now let it lie." The cold cruelty of it struck her near speechless. She stared at him. "Let it lie," she said. "He is a child, Otis. A child, not a stray dog to be shooed off the porch. How can you stand there and look at him and feel nothing at all?" A muscle flinched in his face at that. Deep and quick, there and gone. It was the same flicker she had caught a dozen times before and never read. But the mask closed over it at once, harder than before. "The boy is trouble," Otis said, flat and final. "Anyone with eyes can see it on him. You take a hard child like that into your home, and you make a rod for your own back. Kindness only ruins such children. It makes them soft, and the world is no nursery, Cara, whatever you would like to believe. Best he learns that young, best he learns it now, while it can still do him some good. Kindness ruins them." She stared at him as though she had never truly seen him before. "You cannot believe that. You cannot. No man believes a thing so cruel who has not first been taught it cruelly himself." For a moment he had no answer for her. The dying fire snapped and settled in the grate. A struggle worked in his hard face that he could not quite master. She saw it work. She had grown skilled these months at reading the small weather of his face. It was the only weather he ever let show. And what crossed it now was not anger. It looked for half a breath like a man struck on an old bruise. Then it was gone, shuttered, and the gray mask came back down. But she had seen it. She filed it away with all the rest. The flinches and the silences, the pie eaten in secret, the gentleness in the barn, the pieces of a puzzle she could not yet put together and could not stop trying to. Cara had swallowed so much, these long months in that cold house, the bare and lonely room, the chill courtesy that passed between them for a marriage, the long weeks with no warm word, no glad look, no hand reaching for hers in the dark. She had swallowed it all and kept her peace and told herself patience would answer in the end. But this she could not swallow. This rose up in her and would not be put down by any patience. She rounded on her husband with 2 years of buried grief and 2 long months of loneliness behind her, and she let him have the truth of it. "What kind of man," she said, low and trembling, "looks at a friendless child and turns his face away, a child with no one in all the world? I have tried to understand you, Otis Dyer. God above knows how I have tried. I have made every excuse for you a wife could make. I have told myself you were only shy of warmth. I have told myself it would come in time that you only needed teaching. But this I cannot understand, and this I will not." "You don't know what you're asking," he said, very low. "Then tell me, make me know it. Give me one reason, one true reason, and I will hold my peace." She waited. He said nothing. "No," she said, "you have no reason, only a hardness where your heart should be." The words landed on him like blows. She watched each one strike home and saw him flinch from it and could not stop. He said far more than he meant to then in his anger. He said more than he had said to a living soul in 30 years, that the boy was trouble and would come to nothing. That kindness was a lie, a soft lie, that left a child broken and weeping when the hard world came at last to collect. That no one had ever once spared Otis Dyer a tender word in all his life. That he had done well enough without it, better than well. He had built an empire without it. The words came out of him hard and fast and bitter, a flood through a broken wall. And beneath every one of them, underneath the hardness and the heat, Cara heard something else entirely. She heard a terror in him, a terror so old and so deep and so long buried that the man himself seemed not to know it was there, nor that it was speaking through his mouth. She did not understand it, not yet, not the whole of it. But she heard it, and the hearing of it silenced her where her own anger had not. She stood and looked at him for a long moment in the firelight. The hard man, the cold man, the man who had bought her and set his terms and given her not one tender word. And for the first time she saw dimly that the coldness might not be the truth of him, that it might be a wall, and a high one, with something hurt and hiding behind it. The thought did not soften her anger over the boy. Nothing could soften that. But it tangled it and confused it and left her with no clean thing to feel. "I don't know what was done to you, Otis," she said at last, quietly. "But something was. I'd stake my life on it." He did not answer. He would not look at her. And she turned and left him there by the dead hearth, because there was nothing more to say that he would hear. They parted that night to separate rooms, farther apart than they had ever been under that roof. Cara lay awake in the dark and wept. She wept for a boy she would never now be let to hold, going off across the valley to a hard and loveless place. She wept for a husband she could not reach, walled away behind his cold and his fear. And she wept for the bleak ruin her marriage had shown itself to be, the bargain that was only ever a bargain, the house that would never be a home. Down the hall, Otis sat up alone in the dark the whole night through in the chair by the dead fire. He sat with a past he could not bring himself to speak aloud. He sat with a self-loathing no amount of land nor cattle nor cold pride could drown. The house was very quiet around them, the two of them awake in it and apart. Outside, the wind came down off the mountains and worried at the eaves. Somewhere across the dark valley, the boy slept his last night in the agent's care. He did not know what the morning held, or perhaps he knew it too well. And in the fine cold house on the hill, the husband and the wife lay sleepless in their separate rooms. The same boy lay between them and a wall they did not know how to climb. Neither of them slept that night, and the train in the morning would not wait. Chapter 15. By the time the Dyers reached town the next morning, the matter was nearly done. They had risen gray and silent and sleepless, the both of them. They made the long, cold drive without a word. Cara had hoped in some corner of her heart that the night might have worked on him, that she would find him changed in the morning, softened, ready. She found him only grayer and more closed and more silent than before. No better home had come forward for the boy. No kindly family had stepped up in the night with a change of heart. The train was due to roll on by noon, on up the line to the next town and the next platform full of waiting strangers. A placing agent could not carry one hard boy up and down the country forever, not while the good homes went to the soft little ones and the years went by. Miss Webb stood at her ledger by the meeting house steps, her pen in hand, her tired face set. The Shawshanks stood before her, Silas and his sour wife, ready to take their new hand across the valley. Cara saw the agent's face, and there was no gladness anywhere in it. Francine Wise was no fool, and no hard woman either, whatever her trade had made of her. She had seen the Shawshanks' kind before, 100 times in 100 towns. She knew, none better, what waited for a boy in a place like that. It was written plain in the man's cold eyes and his wife's thin mouth. But her ledger counted a placed child a success and a returned child a failure. The work she did was stretched too thin and funded too poorly to let her be particular. There were always more children than there were homes. There were always more trains. Reluctantly, with a weariness that was its own quiet grief, she dipped her pen. In the book, she wrote only what the book asked of her, that a hard boy was better placed than sent back east unwanted. She did not look at the boy as she wrote it. Cara marked that and understood it. The young woman could not afford to look. To look was to know, and to know was to be unable to do what the work required. So she kept her eyes on the page and signed her name, and made the boy the Shawshanks in the eyes of the law. It was, perhaps, the only mercy she had left to give him. She did not let him see her pity. Pity would not feed him nor warm him. It would only tell him, plainer than ever, how poor his lot was. Across the valley, the wagon carried him, and Cara watched it go. She had come that morning ready to fight for him. The words had been gathered and ready on her tongue, the whole long, sleepless night. She had meant to beg, to argue, to shame her husband into it before the whole town if she must. They were of no use to her now, those words. Otis had said nothing in the night to change his mind, and he said nothing now, standing gray and silent at the edge of the crowd, a stone among men. The papers were signed. The ink was dry. The boy was the Shawshanks to work as they pleased. There was no longer any place in it for a wife's pleading. Cara knew it, and the knowing was bitter as gall. She watched the boy climb up into the back of the Shawshank wagon, among the feed sacks and the tools. He did not look back. Not at the town, not at the agent, not at the crowd that had passed him over. There was nothing behind him worth a backward glance. He knew it, and he faced forward into whatever was coming, the way he seemed to face everything. He sat with his thin shoulders hunched against the cold, his chin up still, defiant to the last. He rode off toward the mean farm and the hard years that waited for him there. Cara watched until she could no longer make out the small, set figure of him among the sacks. Then she watched the empty road a while longer, because she could not make herself stop. What waited for him, Cara knew now with a terrible certainty. She had heard it the night before from Otis's own mouth, though he had not known he was telling it. The barn, the belt, the labor without end, and the love that never comes. She knew it all and could do nothing, and the wagon grew smaller down the valley road. At the edge of the crowd, Otis watched the wagon go too. He said nothing. He did nothing. He only stood and watched, the way he had stood and watched the whole of it. But in the set of the boy's hunched shoulders, growing small in the distance, he saw himself. He saw himself plain. He saw himself riding away in the back of the Craw's wagon, 30 years gone. A thin boy with a carpet bag and no one to wave him off. The same road, the same silence, the same cold sky overhead, the same child being carried away to be used up and thrown aside. The sight of it turned him sick to his very soul, and still he could not move. And still he could not speak. He could have stopped it with a single word, and he had not. The knowledge settled in him like a swallowed stone, cold and heavy and lodged past bringing up. He was the strongest man in the valley, and he had stood by like the weakest. He had let it happen. He had let the boy go, the way no one had ever stepped in to stop him being let go. The shame of it was a thing he had no name for and no bottom to. He told himself it was done now and could not be undone. He told himself the boy was not his concern, had never been his concern, was only a stranger off a train. The words rang hollow even in his own head, for he had seen the boy's face. He had seen his own face in it, and a man cannot watch himself be carried off to ruin and call it no concern of his, however hard he tries. The wagon dwindled down the valley road and was gone behind a rise. The dust of it settled. The crowd broke up, the families to their homes, the talk already turning to other things. Only the Dyers stood a moment longer. The two of them, not speaking, not touching. The whole weight of what had just happened lay unspoken between them. Then Otis turned for their own wagon, and Cara followed because there was nothing else to do. On the long, silent drive home, he could not bring himself to meet his wife's eyes. There was nothing in him to say that would mend it, and so he said nothing. He had failed the boy. That was plain. Worse, he had failed him for no reason that Cara could see. It looked like some cold hardness of heart that she could only despise. That was how it had to look to her. He knew it, and he could not tell her the truth of it, the real reason, the boy on the platform who was himself. He did not have the words for it. He had buried them too deep too long ago, and he did not have the courage, even now, to dig them up. And Cara's anger that had burned so hot the night before cooled on that drive into something far worse. It cooled into a quiet, settled contempt. She had married a hard man. She had known that and made her peace with it, more or less. A hard man she could live beside. She had lived beside worse. But a hard man who would stand and watch a child carried off to misery? Who would lift no hand to stop it and offer not one word of reason why. That was a thing she did not think she could forgive. She had begun to believe there was good in him, buried deep. She had staked her hope on it, and he had stood by the meeting house steps and let a boy be handed to the Shawshanks. Her hope had felt, in that moment, like a fool's. The small warmth that had begun to grow in her, the tenderness she had felt stirring against all her good sense, the thing she had nursed in secret since the night in the barn. On that bitter ride, it seemed to freeze through entirely, to wither, to die, perhaps, for good and all. That evening, the house was colder than she had ever felt it. She moved through her tasks like a woman under water, slow and far away. She laid a supper neither of them ate. She cleared it again, untouched. The fine rooms stood dark and silent around her. The empty rooms, the rooms she had once dreamed of filling, there would be no filling them now. The one child her heart had reached for was gone across the valley. The man she had married had let him go. She did not know how she was to go on living beside that man as though nothing had broken. They came home to the cold, grand house and went their separate ways within it. The distance between them was wider now than the whole valley that lay between the Bar D and the Shawshank place. Somewhere across that valley, a boy was already learning the shape of his new misery. The cold corner and the long list of chores. And in the fine house on the hill, a husband and a wife sat alone in separate rooms. Each one walled away with a grief the other could not see and could not have eased if they had. The train that had carried the past back to them after 30 years rolled on up the line toward the mountains. By evening it was gone, and its whistle with it, and the valley was silent again. Chapter 16. For 3 days the silence in the house grew until it could scarcely be borne. It was a different silence than the chill quiet that had always lain over the place. That old quiet had been a sort of peace, the peace of two people who did not know each other. This was a silence with a wound in it. It filled the rooms. It sat at the table between them. It followed Cara from the kitchen to the parlor and back. It would not be worked off, however hard she scrubbed and baked and mended. Cara went about her work with a closed face. She set Otis's meals before him and cleared them away again. She spoke to him only when she must, and then only of the plainest things. The coffee's hot, the winds come round. The contempt she felt was a cold, leaden weight. She carried it with her from room to room and could not set it down. She had tried to forgive him. She could not find the way to it. Every time she came near to it, the picture rose up in her. The boy on the platform, the wagon carrying him off. Her husband standing gray and silent and doing nothing at all. Her husband bore it in silence, gray and hollow-eyed, a man with the look of one who has not slept. And he had not slept. She knew it. She heard him in the night, moving about the house, his steps slow on the boards. She heard the door and knew he had gone out to the barn again, to the animals, to whatever it was he could not feel inside the walls. He ate little. He spoke less. Some grim labor was working in him that she could not see, and she was too angry those 3 days to wonder much what it was. On the third night, he came to find her in the kitchen. She was banking the fire for the night, raking the coals together under their gray ash. She did not turn when she heard his step in the doorway. For a long moment he stood there. She felt the weight of him in the room and would not give him the ease of looking up. Let him stand, she thought. Let him find his own words, if he had any. Cara. His voice was rough and lower than she had ever heard it. There's a thing I have to tell you. I should have told you long since. The night you asked about the train, I should have told you then. There's nothing you need tell me. She kept her eyes on the embers, on the small red light of them. I think I understand you well enough now. No, he said, you don't, and that's my fault and none of yours. Something in the way he said it made her turn at last. What she saw in his face stopped the hard words dead in her mouth. The cold mask was gone, clean gone, fallen away. Beneath it was a rawness and a fear. It was the face of a man standing at the very edge of a confession he had spent 30 years not making. She had seen him hard. She had seen him cold. She had glimpsed once or twice the gentleness he hid. She had never seen him afraid. He was afraid now. Sit, he said. Please. Just hear me out, the whole of it. Then you can think of me what you like, and I'll not blame you for it." She sat. He did not. He stood by the cold, dark window with his back half to her. It was the way a man stands who cannot say a hard thing to another's face. His hands were knotted behind him. She watched him gather himself, the way she had watched him gather himself before some hard piece of work. She held her tongue and waited. "That boy on the platform," he began. "Ray, I couldn't take him. You thought it was coldness in me. You thought I felt nothing. It was the furthest thing in the world from nothing." He drew a slow breath, and it shook going in. "I couldn't take him because I was him. 30 years ago. To the very life, Cara. To the very life." And then it came out of him, all of it, in the low, flat voice of a man reading out a sentence against himself. He told her of the streets of New York, where a boy with no name slept under market stalls and ran errands for pennies. He told her of the men who swept him up and scrubbed him and pinned a tag to his coat that he could not read, of the long train west and the hope he had carried on it, fierce and secret and bright. He told her of the meeting house platform in a raw Missouri town, of the soft little ones chosen and carried off, of the families whose eyes passed over a thin plain boy and moved on, of the Craws who stopped before him at last, who felt his arms and pried open his mouth to count his teeth and bought him for the strength of his hands. He told her of the barn he slept in, and the belt that taught him, and the cold suppers eaten alone on the step. He told her how he had worked and worked and worked, a child certain in his bones that if only he were useful enough, good enough, quiet enough, then someday someone would come to love him. He kept his back to her through all of it. His voice never rose. It was worse somehow for the flatness of it. He had told the tale so many times to himself in the dark that all the feeling had worn off the words. "They never did," he said. "5 years I waited on it. 5 years I earned and was never once paid. Then they went to another train. They brought home a little one, a fair small boy, called him son, sat him at their own table." He paused. "And I saw the truth of it then plain. They could love a child fine. There was nothing wrong with them, nor with their hearts. They just never once meant to waste a drop of it on me." Cara sat very still, her hard feelings draining out of her as she listened, like water out of a cracked jug. "When I saw that boy on the platform yesterday," Otis went on, "I saw myself. Same jaw set against the crying, same flat eyes, daring the world to want him and knowing it wouldn't. And when the Shawshank stepped up and felt his arm, I saw the Craws. I saw the whole of it about to happen over again. The barn and the belt and the long, unpaid years to a boy who was me." His voice broke at last, just slightly, a crack running through the flatness. "I couldn't move. I couldn't make a sound. To reach out for him was to reach back into all of it with my bare hands, and I could not do it. God help me, Cara, I was that frightened. A grown man, the richest in the county, frightened of a child on a platform. I let him go because I was a coward, and I have hated myself for it every hour since." He fell silent. The fire ticked and settled in the grate. The whole of it hung in the warm kitchen air between them, 30 years of it, finally spoken. He had never told it to a living soul. He had never let himself remember it, and he had laid it all down now at his wife's feet. He stood with his back to her and waited to be despised. Cara rose from her chair. She crossed the kitchen slowly to where her husband stood. The contempt she had carried for 3 cold days was gone. She felt about inside herself for it and could not find it anywhere. It had dissolved entirely, washed clean away. A grief and a tenderness so large it frightened her had washed it away. She understood it all now. Every cold thing he had ever done. The bare grand house, the buried warmth driven down into the animals, the flinch at the word home, the walls built high, stone on stone, around a wound that had never once in 30 years been let to heal. She had thought herself married to the most flint-hearted man in the county. She saw now that she was married to the most deeply wounded. And she saw, too, what the telling had cost him. He had carried this for 30 years and told no one. Not Garrett, who loved him. Not a soul. He had locked it down so deep that he had half forgotten it himself, until a boy on a platform pried it loose. And now he had handed it to her, the whole shameful weight of it. He stood waiting for her to despise him, as he despised himself. There is no rougher country in the world than a man's own buried past, and he had ridden into it for her, with his back turned and his voice shaking so that she might understand. "Otis," she said softly, and she reached out and took his scarred hand in both of hers. He went rigid at the touch, as he always did, every muscle of him. For a moment she was sure he would pull away, the way he pulled away from every kindness she had ever offered. But he did not. This time, he did not. His hand turned over slowly in hers, uncertain, like a thing not sure it is allowed. His rough fingers closed around hers, and he held on. He held on hard, as though she were the one solid thing in a whole world that had given way beneath him. For the first time since she had stepped down off the train, they were not master and bargain. They were not buyer and bought, nor employer and employed, nor two strangers sharing a cold table. They were only two grieving people, standing close in one warm, lamplit room, holding on to one another in the dark. And in the soft light of the kitchen, the coldest man Cara Dyer had ever known bowed his iron-gray head over their joined hands. He let his wife hold him, and he did not let go. Chapter 17. Word of the boy began to drift back across the valley, the way such word does. It came in scraps, carried on the wind of small talk. The hands brought it in from town. The storekeeper let it fall. It surfaced in the Sunday gossip after church between the weather and the price of beef. The Shawshank boy was worked dark to dark, folks said. They shook their heads, then moved on to other things. He was thin already and growing thinner. He slept in a lean-to off the barn with the stock. He went to no school. He wore the same ragged coat against the coming winter. The folk who carried these scraps meant little by them. It was only talk. They could not have known what each scrap did to the man who heard it. For each report was a page torn straight out of Otis's own boyhood. It was read aloud to him by strangers who did not know they held the book. The lean-to, the ragged coat, the labor without end. He had lived every word of it himself 30 years gone and buried it deep. Now it came back to him second-hand over the supper table, told flat and careless by people who thought it no great matter, a hard boy on a hard farm. The country was full of them. What was one more? Otis took every word of it like a blow and said nothing. He had told Cara the whole of his own story now, that night in the kitchen, and the telling had changed something between them. It had not made him a warm man overnight. A wall 30 years high does not come down in a night, but a door had opened in it, just a crack, and a little light came through. He spoke to her differently now. He let her see, here and there, the things that worked in him. And so when the talk turned to the Shawshank boy, he did not go gray and silent, shut up tight, as he once would have. He went still. He set down his fork, and he let his wife see the grief in his face. It was a thing he had never once let any living soul see before. But Cara saw what it did to him. She had learned to read him now since the night in the kitchen. She saw him grow still and gray at the supper table when the boy's name came up. She saw the muscle work in the hinge of his jaw, the small, hard sign of a man holding himself in. The man who had buried his own past for 30 years could not bury it now. It would not stay down. It was living and breathing on a mean farm 5 miles off, hauling water and taking the strap, wearing his own young face. Then he began to ride out of his way. She noticed it first in small things, the way a wife notices. There was the long road home he took now from the north pasture, past the Shawshank place. The near road would have carried him home a good deal sooner. He came in late from his rides, with no account of where he had been, and she did not ask for one. She did not press him. She thought she knew well enough where he had been and why. One evening she asked him gently over the fire. They sat together now of an evening, which they had not done before. It was a small change and a new one, 2 chairs drawn near the same hearth. She chose her moment, and her voice was soft. "You've been riding past their farm," she said. He was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the flames. "I have. To see him. I tell myself I won't." He stared into the fire as though the answer lay in it. "Then I find my horse has carried me that way again, without my telling it to. I can't seem to help it, Cara. I see that small figure out in the yard, hauling a pail too heavy for him, and I'm 10 years old again. I can't look at him, and I can't make myself stay away. I just sit my horse on the road and watch, like a fool. What does he do when he sees you? A grim, crooked, almost smile crossed Otis's hard face. Once, he caught me at it, watching from the road. He stared right back at me, flat and hard, not a flicker in him, like he was daring me to say a word or be gone. It was my own face, 30 years back, staring at me across a rail fence. He shook his head slowly. I had to turn my horse and ride off. I couldn't bear it. A grown man, run off by the look of a boy. Cara reached across the small space between their chairs and laid her hand over his. He did not pull away from the touch now, as he once would have. That was a new thing, too, and she marked it and was glad. "You're not a fool," she said quietly. "A fool feels nothing. It's the other way with you. You feel too much and have spent your whole life pretending you don't." He said nothing to that, but his hand turned, slow, beneath hers and held it. She did not mock him for the rides, nor call them foolish, nor tell him to put the boy from his mind. She knew now what that cost him. Instead, she began quietly to do what little she could. When the boy's errands brought him into town, she found reasons of her own to be there. She would happen to be at the store when he came for the Shawshanks flour. She would happen to be passing when he watered the team at the trough. And each time she slipped him something. A hard-boiled egg, still warm in her glove. A wedge of pie wrapped carefully in a clean cloth. An apple. She pressed them into his thin, chapped hands quickly before he could think to refuse. Then she moved on before anyone could mark it. Once, when the first real cold came down off the mountains, she gave him a warm wool muffler. She told him low to keep it under his coat where Silas would not see it and take it from him. The boy took these things warily, saying little, trusting nothing. His flat eyes watched her face for the trick in it. But he took them. He was too hungry and too cold not to. The first time, he had nearly refused. He had drawn back from the wrapped pie as though it might bite him. "What's it for?" he had asked, low and suspicious. "What do you want?" Cara had understood the question better than he knew. A boy used hard learns that nothing comes free, that every kindness is a hook with a barb in it. "Nothing," she had told him gently. "I want nothing at all. Eat it where they won't see." He had looked at her for a long moment. Then he had taken the pie and bolted it down fast, the way a stray dog eats, with one eye on the door. It had nearly broken her heart to watch. After that, he watched for her in his guarded way. He never thanked her. He never smiled. But his flat eyes found her face in a crowd now and held it a moment, and that was thanks enough. She did not press him for more. She knew from her husband the long, slow patience such a boy required. She only kept on. An egg here, an apple there, a warm word asking nothing back. Stone by small stone, she set herself to wearing down a wall 30 years in the building. It was the same wall she lived beside at home. Each small contact she carried home to Otis like a gift. She told him every time how the boy had looked, whether his face was thinner, whether he seemed fed at all, whether the cough she had heard in him was better or worse, and Otis listened to every word with a hunger he could not hide, and did not try to. He leaned toward her in the firelight, as though she were bringing him news of his own child. He asked her to tell it twice. He asked what the boy had said, and how he had said it, and whether he had smiled. He knew already that he would not have. Bent together over their worry for the boy, the two of them began to change. The cold space between them that had stretched so wide on the bitter ride home narrowed now, evening by evening. They had a cause that was theirs alone, the two of them, a shared and aching purpose, and it drew them to the same hearth, night after night. They spoke of the boy, and then, by degrees, they spoke of other things. The small things a husband and wife speak of that they had never spoken of before. Almost without noticing the change in themselves, they had stopped being a master and his bargain. They had become, in the low lamplight of those evenings, something far more like partners. And underneath the worry, so quiet that neither yet dared to name it, a slow change was working. The cold contract of their marriage was warming into something with a beating heart. Slat, Chapter 18. The shared cause drew them to the kitchen table night after night. It had not always been so. For months, the evenings had been a thing to be got through. each of them alone in a separate room. The silence stretched between like a cold field. Now the evenings were the best of the day. Now there was a reason to draw the two chairs near, a topic to talk over, a warmth in the lamplight that had not been there before. The boy across the valley had done that, without ever knowing it. In their worry for him, the husband and wife had found their way at last to one another. There, in the low, warm light, they plotted their small mercies for the boy. A parcel of warm socks left where he alone would find it. A quiet word with the storekeeper to slip him an extra measure of meal. A watch kept between the two of them on how thin he grew and how hard he was driven. They were quiet conspiracies, hatched in murmurs over the guttering lamp. Small things, all of them, for they dared do no large thing. But they were something. They were better than the standing by that had shamed them both. And somewhere in those late councils, bent close together, the two of them became at last true allies. It was strange to Otis to have an ally. He had never had one. He had never wanted one, or let himself want one, which came to the same thing. He had done everything alone, all his life, by choice and by hard habit. Now here was his wife, leaning into the lamplight beside him, scheming with him over a boy. The strangeness of not being alone in a thing sat oddly and not unpleasantly in his chest. He found himself telling her things, small things at first, how the work had gone that day, a trouble with the north fence, a buyer who had tried to cheat him. He had never told anyone such things. He had kept his own counsel for 30 years, locked up tight. Now the words came easier, by little and little, the way water finds a crack and widens it. And she listened. That was the marvel of it to him. She listened as though his small troubles mattered, as though he mattered. She asked her quiet questions, and was there again the next evening to hear the rest. No one had ever simply listened to Otis Dyer. He had not known how much he wanted it until he had it. Otis began to look at his wife differently. He had not meant to. That was the truth of it. He had sent away east for a sensible woman to keep his house and bear him an heir. That was the whole of what he had bargained for. But across the lamplit table now of an evening, he found himself watching her when she was not looking. He watched the warmth of her that she spent so freely on the hands, on the stock, on a strange boy across the valley. He watched the stubborn goodness in her that would not let a friendless child go cold. He watched the way she had filled his bare and comfortless house with a warmth he had no word for. It made him glad for the first time in his life to come in at the end of a long day. It made the big rooms a little less empty. The watching was no longer practical, and it unsettled him to know it. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself a man might be glad of a sensible wife without it meaning more than that. But the telling did not hold. For he caught himself, of an evening, hoping she would smile. He caught himself saving up some small thing from his day, only to tell her at supper and watch her face. That was not the way a man feels about a good housekeeper. He knew it, and the knowing would not leave him be. A man watched his stock to judge their soundness. A man watched the weather to plan his work. That was the only watching Otis had ever done. This was a different thing, and he knew it for a different thing. It would not be argued into the shape of the old one. He had meant to acquire a wife. He found, to his deep confusion, that he had come to want this particular woman. Not a wife. Not the idea of a wife, the sensible keeper of his house, her. Cara. Her opinion on a matter which he found he wanted to hear. Her nearness across the supper table which he found he missed when she rose. The rare gift of her smile which she gave so seldom now, after all the cold months. It lit something in him when she did give it, like a coal blown back to life. None of that had been written in any contract he had drawn. None of it could be bought, nor bargained for, nor arranged like a matter of business. It had come on him unasked, and he did not know what to do with it. The discovery frightened him badly. To want was to be open to hurt. That was the one hard lesson he had carried out of the craw barn, and never once unlearned. A man who needed nothing could not be made to suffer for the need. A man who wanted nothing could not be made to ache for the wanting. He could not be broken when the wanting went unanswered. He had built his whole life, stone by stone, on the first of those. He had made himself a fortress of not wanting. And now the second thing had crept in past all his walls, through some gate he had not known was there. It stood inside the keep of him now, and he did not know how to drive it out. He was not sure any longer that he wished to. So he circled the new feeling warily, the way a man circles a fire that has burned him once before. He would catch himself reaching toward it and draw back his hand. He would let his eyes rest on her across the room, then make himself look away, to the fire, to his books, to anything. The old habit of guarding ran deep in him, deeper than the 30 years, down to the very roots of the boy he had been. It did not give up its hold without a fight. Yet for all his guarding, the wanting did not go. It would not be circled away, nor stared down, nor put off. It only grew, quiet and stubborn and sure, like a green thing pushing up through hard-packed ground that no weight can hold down forever. Cara felt the change in the air between them. She could not have said exactly how she knew it. There was nothing she could have pointed to and named. It was in the way he lingered now at the table when the night's plotting was done. He would find one more thing to say, reluctant to go up alone to his cold room. It was in the way his flat gray eyes softened, just slightly, when they rested on her and thought themselves unseen. It was in the small courtesies that had crept into him. The chair drawn out, the coat held, the door. It was in 100 small things a woman feels in the air, long before she can find the words for them. And she dared, for the first time since she had stepped down off that train, to wonder. She had come west certain that she would only ever be useful to him, a good housekeeper, a sound investment, well tended because a wise man tends what is his, a wife valued for what she could keep and what she might produce, and never for herself. She had grieved that, quietly, all those cold months. Now, in the slow warming of that house, she let herself wonder if it might not be so, whether she might be something more to him, after all, whether she might, against every cold term of the bargain, be coming somehow to be wanted, for her own self, for nothing she could do or keep or bear, but only for being Cara. The hope was small and frightening and almost unbearably sweet. She was careful with it. She had been disappointed before, more than once. She knew the cost of leaning the whole weight of her heart on that which might not bear it. So she did not let herself run ahead. She did not let herself dream too far. She only marked each small thaw as it came and was glad of it and asked no more than the day gave her. A chair drawn near, a trouble told, a smile returned. Small things, all of them. But she had learned in a hard life that small things faithfully kept were how a marriage was truly built, far more than the grand ones, brick by brick, day by day. She held the hope close against her heart and said nothing of it and watched, day by day, her hard husband begin to thaw. Chapter 19. It came to a head on a raw night in late fall, with the first hard frost in the air. The season had been turning for weeks. The grass had gone brown and brittle. The cottonwoods down by the creek had dropped their leaves. The mornings came white with rime, and at night the frost reached down out of the mountains and gripped the whole valley in its fist. It was no longer a country a body could be caught out in. The first man to freeze that winter had not yet frozen, but he would, somewhere, as men did every year. The cold did not care whose child it took. The boy had been beaten once too often. No one ever learned the whole of what passed at the Shawshank farm that evening. What was certain was only this. Silas had taken the strap to the boy over some small infringement. A spilled pail, a slow chore, a word answered wrong as he had 100 times before. And this time the boy did not bend to it. This time, like another boy on another farm 30 years gone, the last of his patience reached its end. This time, he ran. Ray bolted from the Shawshank place into the dark, with no coat on his back and nowhere to go. The news reached the Bar D near midnight. A rider from town pounded on the door with it, breathless, his horse blowing great clouds in the cold. The Shawshank boy had run off, he said, into the night. Silas had searched his own near land by lantern, half-heartedly, and given it up. He had washed his hands of the whole matter. The boy could freeze for all of him, he said, the ungrateful young whelp, and a hard frost was coming down fast. There was a child loose somewhere in the high, cold country, alone in the dark, with no coat and the temperature falling by the hour. Cara's hand flew to her mouth. She turned to her husband. The whole of it passed before her in an instant. The frozen draws, the killing frost, a thin boy with no coat, somewhere out in all that dark. She had carried food to him for weeks. She had given him a muffler against this very cold, and now the cold had him, out in the open. The muffler would not be enough. Nothing would be enough, unless someone went after him. She knew it. She knew, too, what she was asking when she turned her stricken face to her husband. She was asking him to ride straight into the worst night of his own life, the night he had buried 30 years deep. Otis stood very still in the lamplight. For one long, terrible moment, the old paralysis seized him. She saw it take hold of him, the way she had seen it take him on the platform. The frozen look came over his face, the gray stillness, the past closing over him like cold black water closing over a drowning man. It was the same as it had been every time the boy's hard fate came too near his own. She saw it, and her heart sank. She thought he would freeze again and do nothing, and let the cold have the child. But this time, the ice cracked clean through. For Otis knew, better than any man alive in that country, exactly where a runaway boy went. He knew what the cold did to a child with no coat and no shelter and no soul coming to look. He did not have to guess at it. He had been that very child on just such a freezing night, running from just such a hard man. The difference, the only difference, was that no one had ridden out after him. No one had come. No lantern had searched the draws for him. He had lived through that night on nothing but luck and a passing cattle drive and the grace of God. And he knew with a grim and absolute certainty how easily he might not have lived at all, how close it had run, how many boys, on how many such nights, did not come in at dawn. This boy would not run alone into the dark, not while Otis Dyer drew breath. Something shifted in his face, and Cara watched it happen before her eyes. The frozen past broke, cracked, and fell away from him like ice off a thawing eve. And underneath it was a man she had never quite seen before. A man deciding all at once, and for good and forever. The fear was still in him. She could see that too. It had not left him, but it had been overruled, put down, mastered by something stronger that rose up under it. A force that had lain 30 years buried in the frozen ground of him, and was now at last awake. "Get my coat," he said, "and the heavy blankets, the wool ones, and go tell Garrett to light a lantern in the window. Keep it lit till I'm back, however long that is." He was already moving as he said it, crossing to the door, dragging on his boots. His voice had gone hard and sure and quick. The man who could not speak on the platform was gone, vanished as though he had never been. In his place stood a man who knew exactly what was wanted and exactly how to do it. A man who would let nothing on God's earth stand in his way. It was the man who had built the Bardee out of nothing, turned now to a finer purpose than land. And Cara, watching, understood what it cost him. To go out after the boy was to go back. Back to the cold and the dark and the running. Back to the terror of being a child alone with the night closing in. He had spent 30 years making sure he never went back there. Now he was pulling on his boots to ride straight into it, on purpose, for a boy who was no kin to him. She had never in her life been so afraid for a man. She had never, she realized, been so proud of one. Cara flew to fetch his coat. She brought the heavy blankets and a flask filled with hot coffee and her own warm scarf besides. She pressed them all into his arms at the door, her hands quick and shaking. There was so much to fear, and so little time to say any of it. "Bring him home," she said. Her voice shook on the words. "Otis, bring our boy home." The word hung in the cold air between them. Our. Neither of them had ever said it before, not once. The boy was not theirs, in any law or fact. He was the Shawshanks, signed and sealed. And yet the word had come out of her without her choosing it. It was the truest word she had ever spoken, and it hung there shining between them in the lamplight. He looked at her for one long moment over the bundled blankets, and something passed between the two of them in that look that needed no words at all. Then he pressed her hand hard, once with his own cold hand. He turned and went out into the freezing dark to find the child whom the cold and the cruel country were waiting to claim. She stood in the open doorway and watched him ride out, the lantern swinging and bobbing from his saddle. Smaller and smaller it grew. until the dark swallowed both the light and the man. The words he had not answered hung on in the empty house long after he was gone. Our boy. He had not said it back, but he had not denied it either. He had pressed her hand and ridden out into the killing cold to find a boy who was no kin to either of them. And that was answer enough, and more. She held the word to her, like a live coal cupped against the cold. She shut the door against the night. The hours that followed were the longest of her life. She built up the fire, set water to heat, and laid blankets to warm by the hearth. All the small, useless tasks a body does to keep the fear at bay. She went to the window 100 times. She saw only the dark and the far icy stars. Now and again, she saw the small, swinging light of Garrett's lantern crossing the yard, for the old man would not sleep either. Somewhere out in that black country, her husband was riding and a child was freezing. There was nothing she could do but tend a fire and wait and pray. So Cara Dyer knelt down on the cold floor of the silent house. For the first time in a long and bitter while, she began to pray. She prayed for the boy. She prayed for the man. She prayed that the one would reach the other in time. Chapter 20. Otis rode into the freezing dark with a lantern and a certainty. He did not search blindly, casting about over the country at random. He rode as a man rides who knows his quarry's mind. For his quarry's mind had once been his very own. A boy with nowhere to go did not run for the road, where men and wagons would find him and turn him back. He did not run for a neighbor's door, for he had learned to trust no door. He ran for the high country, away from people, for some draw or windbreak out of the worst of the wind. There he would hole up like a hunted animal, small and still, and wait out the dark. He would wait for a morning that might never come. The same hard instinct that had once saved Otis's own young life now bent itself after 30 years to the saving of the boy's. The cold bit deeper as he climbed. The frost made the dead grass crackle and snap under the horse's hooves. It was a cruel night, and it took him back. He had not meant to let it, but it took him all the same. The cold on his face was the same as another night, 30 years gone. The dark was the same dark. The fear that rode with him, sharp under his ribs, was the boy's own fear, dug up alive. He had run through such a night himself, a thin boy with no coat, and no one had come. He gripped the reins harder and rode on into it. This time, by God, someone was coming. This time, the boy would not be left. An ordinary man might have ridden right past the boy and never found him. An ordinary man would have searched the roads and the near fields and given it up by the second hour, half frozen himself. But Otis was not searching as an ordinary man searches. He was searching as the boy himself. He asked at every fork in the dark which way a frightened child would turn, and turned that way too. It was a terrible gift, this knowing. It had been bought at a terrible price 30 years before. Now, for the first time, it was worth something. He pushed up into the high draws north of the Shawshank place, where the land folded and rose toward the timber. He swung the lantern slowly from side to side as he went, throwing its yellow light into every black hollow. He called the boy's name into the dark. Ray, Ray. For a long while, there was nothing. There was only the wind off the peaks, the creak of the frozen saddle, his own breath smoking white in the lantern light. He began to fear he had guessed wrong. He began to fear the cold had been quicker than he was. Then, in the lee of a low rocky windbreak, the lantern light caught a small, huddled shape against the stone, and Otis's heart turned clean over in his chest. The boy was there. Half frozen he was, blue about the lips, feral with fear and cold. He had wedged himself into the rock the way a hunted animal wedges itself. He had made of his own body the smallest target he could. At the sound of the horse, at the sudden light, he came up scrambling. Ray backed hard against the rock, his fists raised before him. They shook so with the cold that he could scarcely hold them up. "Stay back," he rasped. His voice was nearly gone. "I won't go. I'll die out here before I go back to him. I mean it. I mean it." Otis swung down from the horse. He did not rush the boy. He had gentled too many frightened creatures to rush this one. He came forward slowly, his hands held open and empty at his sides, his voice low. And then he did a thing he had not done in 30 years, a thing he had nearly forgotten a man could do. He knelt down. He knelt right down in the frozen grass, in the killing cold, so that his eyes came level with the child's. He was not a tall man looming over a small one now. He was only a man, kneeling, the same height as a frightened boy. "I'm not taking you back," he said, low and steady. "Not there, not ever. You hear me, son? Never again, not while I live." The boy stared at him through the dark, shaking, trusting nothing. "Liar," he whispered. "Everyone says that. Everyone always says that." "I know they do." Otis held the boy's flat, frightened gaze and did not look away. "I know it better than you would ever believe, so listen to me now. Listen close. None of it was your fault. You hear? Not the running, not the strap, not one bit of it, not ever. You were never the trouble, whatever they told you. The man who would take a strap to a child, he is the trouble. That was him. That was never, ever you." Something broke in the boy's set face. The boy had braced against the cold, the dark, the fear. He had held himself together through all of it. He had not braced against kindness. He had no guard against that, for he had never needed one. And so the gentle words went in where the hard world never could, straight to the quick of him. They undid in a moment what years of the strap had built. They were words one soul had once spoken to Otis Dyer. They were the very words he had needed his whole childhood, lying cold in the straw, spoken only that once by an old hired man. He had carried their absence in him for 30 years, and now he watched them land on the child as they would have landed on himself. The boy's raised fists came slowly down. His hard face crumpled, all at once, into the face of the child he truly was, and he began to shake with something other than the cold. Otis gathered him up. He wrapped him close in the heavy wool blankets and held him against his own broad chest, out of the wind. He let him shake and said the words again, low, as many times as the boy needed. "Not your fault. Never your fault. You're safe now." He held him until the worst of the shivering passed and the worst of the weeping with it. They sat there in the lee of the rock, the lantern burning beside them, the frozen stars wheeling overhead. At first light, he did not turn for home. He turned instead for the Shawshank place, with the boy wrapped warm and half asleep before him on the saddle. A grim, settled purpose had hardened in his chest. There was a reckoning to be finished, and he meant to finish it. Silas Shawshank came out into his yard at the sound of the horse, sour and unshaven, pulling his suspenders up over his underclothes. "You found him," he said, squinting up. "Good. Hand him down, then. He's got chores owing, and a hiding besides." "No," Otis said. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to raise it. He sat his horse and looked down at Silas Shawshank and let the silence do its work. Behind that one flat word stood 20 years of being the most respected and most feared man in the county. Behind it stood a lifetime of knowing from the inside exactly what manner of man this was and exactly what he was worth. "The boy's indenture," Otis said. "I'm buying it out, here and now. Name your price, and name it fair. The whole county is going to hear of this thing by Sunday either way, and they'll hear how you named it." Silas blustered and reddened and named a figure meant to insult, a figure meant to make the rich man balk. Otis counted the money out into his hand without a word, coin on coin, more than the man deserved by far. Then he leaned down from the saddle, close, so that only Shawshank would hear, and said the last of it quietly. "You laid hands on a child for the last time, Shawshank. Hear me well. You come near this boy again, or speak his name aloud in this valley, and you will answer to me for it. And I am not a forgiving man. I think you know that much about me." Then he straightened in the saddle and turned his horse. He rode away out of that mean yard and did not look back at it once. He brought the boy home to the Bar D, wrapped in his own good coat against the cold. The boy's head lay heavy and trusting at last against his chest. As they came up the long rise toward the house, the lantern still burned in the window where Garrett had set it and kept it. It was a small, steady light against the gray dawn. Cara stood waiting on the porch, a shawl clutched about her, though the dawn was bitter. She must have stood there half the night, the orphan who had sworn on a dark road 30 years gone that he would only ever keep land and never need a living soul. He rode in now through his own gate, and he carried something far more precious than any land, held warm and breathing against his heart. He had ridden out into the dark to save a boy from the cold. And somewhere out there, in that dark, he had ridden clean through the last cold wall around his own guarded heart. He never quite knew the moment it happened. He had come out the far side of it a different man. Chapter 21. Ray came to the Bar D like a cornered animal, and for a long while he behaved as one. He flinched from a raised hand, though no hand at the Bar D was ever raised to him. A sudden move would set him cringing. A loud voice would close his face up tight. He had learned the world as a place of blows. He did not unlearn it in a week nor a month. Food he hid against the future. A crust would go missing from the kitchen. A biscuit would vanish into a pocket, hoarded against a hunger that had always come back around. He spoke little and trusted nothing and asked for nothing. He watched the two of them with a flat, wary eye. He was certain in his bones that this warmth was a trick of some kind, a fattening before the fall. It would be snatched away, he knew, the very moment he let himself believe in it. Cara understood the watching. She did not take it to heart. She had married a grown man who did the very same, so she gave the boy the soft things without stint and asked nothing in return. Full plates set down before him without a word, even on the mornings she knew he had stolen from the pantry in the night. Clean blankets, a warm bed in a real room with a door, the first he had ever called his own. Hot water for washing, a coat that fit him, a steady, undemanding gentleness that asked nothing of him. It did not flinch nor scold when he failed to give anything back. She did not crowd the boy, nor press him, nor reach for him before he was ready. The warmth she simply kept always there, banked and burning, like a fire a body could come to when the cold grew too much. And she let him come to it in his own time, in his own way, the way one waits on a wild creature to feed at last from an open hand. It was slow work. There were days he would not speak at all. There were nights she heard him cry out in his sleep, fighting some old fight in his dreams. She would go and stand at his door and not go in, for she sensed he would not want to be seen. There was the morning she found him gone, her heart in her throat. She found him out in the barn at dawn, sleeping in the straw of an empty stall. The bed was still too soft for him, too strange, too good. He had crept out to the place a boy like him knew. She said nothing of it. She only saw to it that there was a warm blanket left folded in that stall where he would find it. She asked him no questions. By little and by little, the barn nights grew fewer. By little and by little, he learned to sleep in the bed. Otis gave him a different gift, one only Otis in all the world could give. He did not give the boy soft words, for soft words were not in him, and the boy would not have trusted them in any case. What he gave instead was the plain recognition of a man who had stood once in the very place the boy now stood. He did not coax, he did not promise, he made no speeches. He simply let the boy see, day by day, in 100 small, unspoken ways, that he was known. That here, at last, was someone who understood from the inside exactly what he was and exactly what had been done to him. "I know what they made you feel," Otis told him one evening, the two of them alone in the barn. The lantern low. The boy said nothing, only watched him, the way he watched everything. "Like you were worth only the work you could do," Otis went on, low and even. "Like nobody'd ever keep you, nor want you, just for being you. Like you had to earn every scrap, and even then it wouldn't come." He met the boy's flat, hard stare and held it, and did not look away. "I know it because they made me feel the very same, a long time ago, on a farm not so different from the Shawshanks. I was a boy off a train, same as you. And I know it for a lie, Ray. I learned it the hard way, but I learned it. It was a lie about me, and it's a lie about you. No one under this roof will ever make you that again, so long as I draw breath." The boy had armored himself against kindness his whole short life. He had built his walls against pity, against soft hands, against the lie of a smile that meant to use him. They were good walls. They had kept him alive. But he had no armor at all, none, against being understood. There was no guard a body could raise against that. And so the words went in past every defense, straight to the quick of him. The boy's eyes filled. He turned his face away into the dark so the man would not see. Something in him began to give way after that. Not all at once. A wild creature did not gentle in a day, nor a child unlearn a lifetime in a month. But the flinching grew less, by little and by little. The hidden crusts stopped appearing in the pantry. A boy does not hoard against a hunger he has begun to believe will not return. He began to answer when spoken to. He began once or twice to speak first. And one cold, bright morning the boy laughed aloud at something Garrett said over the harness. It was a startled, rusty, cracking sound, as though it surprised him fully as much as anyone. Cara, hearing it from the porch, had to turn quickly away so the boy would not see her eyes fill up. Man and boy took to the ranch work together in the cold, bright mornings. Otis taught him the things old Prout had taught a frightened boy in another barn a whole lifetime ago. The things he had thought lost. How to gentle a nervous horse with a low word and a flat, still palm. How to read a steer's temper by the set of its ears before ever it kicked. How to sit a saddle easy and throw a rope true and move quiet among the great patient animals. They worked side by side through the short, cold days, often without a word for an hour at a stretch. And the wordlessness was not the old cold silence of the house. It was its own kind of peace. The peace of two who understood one another past the need for talk. The boy took to the horses fastest. Otis watched him gentle a skittish young mare one afternoon, low-voiced and patient, his flat eyes gone soft with the work of it. And the man's chest tightened, for it was himself he watched, 30 years gone in old Prout's barn. He had passed it on then. The one good thing that had been given him. The patient gentling, the low word, the flat, kind palm. He had carried it locked inside him for 30 years and thought it lost. And here it was, alive again, passing from his own hands into the boy's. Some kindnesses, he thought, were not so easily killed as a man feared. Some good gifts waited, however long, for a chance to be given again. And teaching the boy, Otis began, without ever meaning to heal the boy he himself had been. He had not looked for that. He had not known it was even possible. He had set out only to save a child from the killing cold, and asked nothing further. But he found, as the days went on, a strange thing. Every kindness he showed Ray was a kindness shown 30 years too late to that other boy on that other platform. Every patient word he gave the child was a word he had needed himself, lying cold in the straw, and never once been given. Every flinch he soothed in Ray soothed something that had flinched in him for 30 years. In the slow, careful gentling of this wary, wounded child, he found himself gentling more than the boy before him. He gentled at last the wary, wounded child he had carried locked inside his own chest the whole of his hard life. The hardness he had worn like armor for 30 years began, day by patient day, to fall quietly away. Garrett saw it first, as the old man saw most things. He said not a word, only smiled into his white whiskers and went on with his work. Cara saw it, and her heart ached with the sweetness of it and the wonder. The cold master of the Bar D was thawing at last before her eyes after all the long frozen years. And the thing that thawed him was the small, fierce boy who was his very mirror, sleeping warm and safe at last under his roof. The two of them were of a kind, the man and the boy, cut from the same hard cloth by the same hard hands. And in the saving of the one, the other was, at long and weary last, being saved himself. Chapter 22. One night, with the boy asleep safe under his roof, Otis saw plainly what he had done to his wife. He sat late by the fire that evening, watching Cara mend a shirt of Ray's by the lamplight. Her head was bent, her needle moving sure and patient through the cloth. It was a small and homely thing to watch, a woman mending a boy's shirt by a warm fire, and yet the sight of it worked on him. The understanding came over him slow and sure, the way the dawn comes, until at last he could not look away. The house had changed around him these past weeks, and he had let it. The boy had brought noise into it, and life and small disorder. There were boots by the door now, and a coat on the peg, and the sound of feet on the stairs. And there was Cara, at the heart of it all, making the cold, grand house at last into a home. He found he could not picture the place without her now. He could not picture himself without her. The thought stopped him cold, sitting there by the fire. For there had been a time not long past when he had pictured every year of his life alone. He had called it good and meant to die so. He had bought her. That was the plain truth of the thing, and he made himself look at it square. He had bought her, the way a man buys whatever he has need of. He had set out his cold terms and named his price, and waited for a woman desperate enough to take them. He had valued her for her use, and nothing more, for the house she would keep, and the heir she might in time provide. It was exactly to the very letter as the Craws had once valued a thin boy for the strength of his arms. He had hated them his whole life for it, and he had grown up and done the same hard thing to another soul. He had never once seen it for what it was, until this quiet night by the fire. The knowing of it shamed him to the very bone. And in the same breath, strangely, it freed him. For he understood now what he had never let himself understand before. He knew from the inside, in his own scarred flesh, the cruelty of being wanted only for one's use. He had carried that wound 30 years, and he had turned around and dealt the very same wound to the woman who sat across the fire from him now, the woman who had thawed his frozen house, the woman who had reached a boy he could not bring himself to reach, and shamed him gently toward the man he ought to be. He could not undo the bargain he had made with her. The words were said, the paper signed, the bleak months lived. But he could perhaps lay down at last the hard, frozen thing he had made of himself. He could come to her now as something else, as a man and not a buyer, as a husband and not a master. It was a hard thing for him, harder than any work of his hands. A man who has never spoken of his heart does not find the words easy, nor the speaking. His whole life had taught him to keep such things locked down where they could not be used against him. To open his mouth now and lay his heart bare was to stand unarmed before the one person who could most wound him. He had ridden into a freezing storm with less fear than he felt now. He sat in his own warm parlor, watching his wife mend a shirt. He set aside his pride, which had been his armor since boyhood, the last and toughest of his walls, and he spoke. "Cara." She looked up from her mending. Something in his voice, a new and naked note, made her go still. She set the shirt down in her lap and waited. "When I sent away east for a wife," he said, "I didn't send for you. I want you to know that before anything. I didn't send for you because I didn't know there was a you. I sent for an idea, a sensible woman to keep my house and bear me a son. One to want for nothing and ask for nothing. That's the truth of what I did, and it was a poor, cold thing to do to a living soul." He stopped. His hands, those hard, scarred hands that had built an empire out of dirt, were not quite steady where they rested on his knees. "But somewhere in these months," he went on, lower now, his voice rough with the strangeness of the words, "that changed. Somewhere I stopped wanting a wife, and I started wanting you, not a keeper for my house. You, your voice in these cold rooms, your stubborn goodness that wouldn't let a hard man stay hard, nor a lost boy stay lost, the way you look at a thing, the way you look at me." He swallowed hard. "If you never gave me a single heir, Cara, not one, I would want you still, for yourself, for your own self, and for nothing else on God's earth. I should have led with that the day you stepped off that train. I led with a contract instead, and I am sorrier for it than I have got the words to say." Cara sat very still. The mending lay forgotten in her lap. Her eyes had filled and brimmed, and she did not trouble to hide it now. She had come west certain, so certain, that she would only ever be useful to a man. A good housekeeper. A sound investment, well tended because a wise man tends what is his. A wife valued for what she could do and what she could bear, and never once for who she was inside. She had grieved that quietly for months, alone in a fine bare room, in a house with no warmth in it. She had folded the dream of being wanted away, the way a woman folds a dress she knows she will never wear. And now the cold man she had married sat before her with his whole unaccustomed heart held out in his unsteady hands, and he was telling her in his plain, rough way that she was wanted, for herself, for nothing but herself. She thought of the long, lonely months and the bare room and the wind at the eaves. She thought of how she had wept that first night, sure she had traded one grief for another. And she thought how far they had come from that night, the two of them, by what a strange and winding road. A boy off a train had done it, a boy neither of them had borne, who had cracked open two frozen hearts and let the light into both. She would never be able to thank that boy enough. She would spend the rest of her days trying. Otis, she said, and could manage no more than his name. She rose from her chair. She crossed the small space of warm lamplight between them. And he rose too to meet her, as though he had only been waiting for her to come. And the man who had held no one in his whole long guarded life took his wife into his arms. He held her as though he had been waiting 30 years to learn how, awkward and certain both at once. She fit there against him as if the place had always only been hers. His iron-gray head bowed down over her warm dark hair. Her arms went round him and held him fast, and neither of them spoke a word, because there was no longer any need of words between them, nor would there ever quite be again. On the warm side of every wall he had ever built, two lonely people stood in the lamplight, holding one another, and the loneliness that each of them had carried so long into that frozen house and through all those bleak months quietly loosed its grip. It let go of them both, finally and for good and forever. They stood so a long while and did not speak. The fire burned low. Upstairs the boy slept on, safe and warm, and theirs. He did not know that down below him, in the lamplight, the last cold corner of the Bar D had thawed at last. It was a marriage now, in truth, and not only in name. It had begun as a bargain, the coldest of bargains, struck between two strangers 1,000 miles apart. It had become, by a long and unlikely road, the truest thing either of them had ever known. And neither would have traded it now, cold beginning and all, for any warmer one in the world. Chapter 23. Miss Francine Wise passed back through the county that winter on her long circuit of the placed children. It was her duty to look in where she could, to see how the placed ones fared. She had not the time nor the means to look in everywhere. She came to the Bar D last of all, and she came expecting the worst. The Shawshank placement had sat ill with her since the very day she signed it. It was a small, cold weight on her conscience that would not lift. She had signed a hard boy over to hard people because the book required it. She had not slept easy on it since. What she found instead astonished her. The hard, passed-over boy she remembered was thriving. There was no other word for it. He was fed, and he was warm, and he was decently clothed against the cold. He rode out at the rancher's side through the winter mornings, easy in the saddle. He slept, she was told, without fear the whole night through. And the flat, daring, friendless stare she so well remembered had softened. It had softened into something almost like the look of an ordinary boy. She could scarce believe it was the same child. "I have placed a great many children, Mrs. Dyer," she told Cara quietly. The two of them stood at the porch rail, watching Ray cross the yard with a coil of rope over his shoulder. "More than I can rightly count. And I will tell you plainly, I do not often get to see one come right like this. More often I see the other thing and carry it with me. May I ask how it happened?" "He was wanted," Cara said simply. That was the whole of it, in the end. He was wanted at last by the one man in this valley who could truly understand him. Miss Webb looked at her a long moment and seemed to understand more than was said, and nodded. "It is rare," she said. "I will carry it with me. There is so much of the other kind." She watched the boy a moment more. "He has a good home here. I do not say that of many. Hold on to him, Mrs. Dyer." "We mean to," Cara said. "We mean to make it lawful, so no one can ever take him back." The agent's tired face warmed. "Then I will help you," she said. "Gladly. It is the best work I am ever asked to do, and the least of it." Then she set about helping the Dyers put the adoption properly in motion. There were papers to be drawn up, and a judge to be satisfied. There was the matter of the bought-out indenture to be settled clean and lawful. The agent saw to all of it with a brisk goodwill, and more than goodwill. She was glad, gladder than she let on, to write a happy ending into her grim ledger for once, to set down one child safe and kept against all the others she could not save. By the spring, it was done, signed and sealed and lawful. Lip was theirs in the eyes of the law and the land. He had long since, quietly, become theirs in every way that truly mattered. It fell to Otis to give the boy his name, and the giving of it moved him as little else had in the whole of his life. For Otis Dyer had never been entirely sure of his own true name. The men in New York had given him one, near enough, off a paper he could not then read. He had carried that name west on the train and worn it through the lean years. He had built a whole county's respect upon it, stone by stone. But he had never once known where it came from. He never knew whether it had been his mother's name, given him in love before she was lost to him, or only some weary clerk's idle choice set down to fill a line on a form. He had made the name mean something with his own two hands. He had never known if it was truly his. And to give that hard-won name now to a boy who had none of his own, freely and forever, asking nothing in return. It struck him as a deep and quiet justice, a thing made right at last, 30 years too late, and yet somehow standing there, not too late at all. They told the boy together, the two of them, on a bright morning in the kitchen. Otis was not a man for speeches, and he did not make one. He simply laid it out plain, the way he laid out everything, and waited. "The papers are done," he said. "You're ours now, in the eyes of the law. If you want it, you'd take our name. You'd be our son, proper and lawful, and this would be your home for good." He paused. "It's your choice. A man ought to get one choice at least, in a matter like this, so it's yours." The boy looked from one of them to the other, slow, as though waiting for the catch in it. There was none. There would never be one again. "Ray Dyer," the boy said, trying the name out slow, turning it over in his mouth as though to test its weight. "If you'll have it," Otis said. "It's yours to keep, free and clear. No one takes it back, not ever. You hear me? It's yours now, the same as your own two hands." The boy took the name with a fierce, shining pride that he could not hide and did not try to. He said it over to himself that night, Cara heard, lying in his bed in the dark. Ray Dyer. Ray Dyer. As though to make it true by saying it, as though afraid it might be gone by morning. It was not gone by morning. It was never gone again. It was his, the way his own two hands were his, and no man would ever take it from him. He was no longer a placed-out hand, kept for his labor and his strong back, to be turned off the day he wore out. He was a son now. He had a name that was his own. He had a home that was his own. He had a brand that would one day, in the fullness of time, be his own as well. And not because he had earned it, not because he had worked hard enough or pleased anyone enough to deserve it, but only because he was loved. That night, after the boy was abed, Otis told Cara the whole of his story, even the very worst of it. He told her the parts he had left out before, in the kitchen, when he could not yet bear to say them all. The hungriest nights when his belly ached against his backbone. The cruelest of the mornings. The little pine horse he had hidden deep in the straw, the only thing that was ever freely his. Old Prout, and his rope lessons, and his dying. The clasp knife he carried in his pocket to this very day, 30 years on. She listened to all of it. She held the secret of it as gently as she held the man himself. She asked him nothing, and she judged him nothing. And in the telling of it, the final tight knot came quietly, gently loose. The knot the long, lonely years had tied up inside him. The great ranch he had built rose up new before his eyes after that. He had raised it for one cold reason only, so that his hard, unloved life might mean something, somewhere, after he was dead and gone. He had wanted to leave a mark the world could not rub out. He saw now, with a clearness that near unmanned him, that it meant something while he yet lived. The land was not a monument now, raised against his own forgetting. It was a roof. It sheltered a wife he loved past saying and a son he had chosen with his own heart. It was no longer a brand raised up to outlast a lonely man and stand cold over his grave. It was a home, warm and loud and living. It was his. He stood on his own porch one evening, Cara drawn warm beneath his arm, the boy mending tack in the yard below. And Otis Dyer understood a truth at last. The land he had fought so hard and so long and given up so much to keep. It had never once been the thing truly worth the keeping. He had spent 30 years learning that lesson, the hard way, the only way he had ever learned anything. But he had learned it, in the end. And the end, he found, was not too late. Chapter 24. By the following spring, the cold, grand house was a place no one would have known. It was warm now, and loud, and lived in. It was a home at last, and it had the sound of one. A boy's boots thundered up and down the stairs at all hours. A woman's voice rang out, calling him in to supper, calling him to wash, calling him to mind his manners. bread baked in the kitchen most mornings so the whole house smelled of it, and the good dining room, built for a large family and stood empty so many years, at last held one. 3 chairs filled now where one had sat alone. The hands sat among themselves, marveling that the master smiled these days. Easy and often over small things and nothing at all. Not a one of them, in 20 hard years of riding for him, had ever once seen him do it before. It was Garrett who took the longest pleasure in the change. The old foreman had known Otis the longest, and waited the most years for it. He would watch the man and the boy ride out together of a morning, side by side. He would smile into his white whiskers and say nothing. He had seen the cold come into Otis, year by year, like frost into a fence post. He had not thought to live long enough to see it go again. He counted himself a lucky old man that he had. Ray grew sturdy and quick and sure under the plain daily miracle of being wanted. He filled out. The gauntness left him. His face, which had been all sharp, hard angles, softened into the face of a boy of 12, which was what he was and had never been let to be. He grew. His wrists shot past his sleeves. Cara let out his coats twice that year and clucked over it and was glad of every inch. He rode at his father's side through the long, bright days. He learned every fence line and water hole of the land that would one day be his own. He slept without fear through the whole of the night, every night. It was a thing he had never done in his short, hard life before. The old flinch left his shoulders by slow degrees. Then one ordinary day, Cara looked up and saw that it was simply gone. She could not, for the life of her, remember when she had last seen it. He laughed now without it surprising him. He spoke up at the table. He argued and sulked and forgot his chores. They were the ordinary failings of an ordinary loved boy. He was never once made to fear for a single one of them. He had a name. He had a home. He had 2 people in the world who would have walked through fire for him, and he knew it now, down in his bones. And so he had stopped, at long last, waiting for it all to be snatched away. Cara carried herself like a woman cherished, rather than a woman merely employed. The change in her was as great as the change in the house, though quieter. Whether or not a child of her own body ever came to her now, she no longer grieved the want of it. Not as once she had in the long, cold nights of that first year. For her arms were not empty anymore. Her house was not cold. She had a husband who reached for her hand across the supper table without thinking, as though he had always done it. She had a son, half-grown and prickly and dear, who had taken in time to calling her mother, shy at first and then easy. She had a whole life now, so much fuller and warmer than the cold bargain she had stepped off that train to accept. Some mornings she scarcely knew how to hold it all in her 2 hands. And Otis, the orphan who had sworn on a dark and lonely road that he would never need a living soul. He had built at last the one thing his whole hard life had never given him: a family, kept and keeping, his. Word came to the Bardee that spring of another orphan train, bound up the line to the railhead. There had been a time not so long past when that word alone would have turned Otis Dyer gray and cold. It would have sent him out to the barn to sit alone with the animals in the dark. It did not now. He heard the news out to its end. He was quiet a moment, turning something over, and then he rose and went to find his hat. His face was not gray at all, but set with a quiet purpose. "Hitch the wagon," he told Ray. "You're coming with me, you and your mother both. There's a thing I want you to see, and a thing I want you to help me do." The boy did not ask what. He had learned to trust the man now, past the need for asking. He hitched the team and climbed up, and Cara climbed up beside him. The 3 of them drove the long road into town together, the way a family drives. Otis said little on the way, but there was a set to his jaw that Cara had come to know. It was the look of a man who had made up his mind to a thing and meant to see it through. This time, Otis Dyer rode in to meet the train himself. He stood by the meeting-house platform in the bright spring light. It was on just such a platform, more than 30 years before and 1,000 miles east, that a thin and friendless boy had stood. He had smiled until his face ached, and been passed over all the same, and learned that he was wanted by no one. Otis stood on it now a different man. He watched the children handed down from the cars, scrubbed and tagged and hoping. He watched the families press close to look them over, and his eye went, as it could not help but go, to the hard ones at the end of the line, the older ones, the wary ones, the ones with their chins up and their hopes shut away, who knew already they would be passed by. He knew them. He had been them. Beside him, he felt Ray go still, watching the same boys for the same reason. Father and son, who had both stood in that line, looked on at the children who stood in it now. And Otis set himself there, deliberate, for one plain reason. His own chosen son stood tall beside him, his wife upon his arm. He meant to see with his own eyes that no hard-eyed boy at the end of the line was ever overlooked and passed by again. Not in this valley. Not for as long as he had breath in him, and land under him, and a warm house to give. The orphan who had sworn never to need anyone had got the whole lesson backward. All those long years, on that dark and lonely road north, he saw it plain now. It was not in needing no one that a man kept himself safe from being hurt. That road led only to a fine empty house and a frozen heart and 30 wasted years. The truth ran the other way entirely. It was in being kept and in keeping others that a man was made whole. He had needed nothing all those years and had nothing for it but cold rooms and an empty table. He had let himself need at last a wife and a boy. And he had everything. It was a simple sum when a body finally saw it. He had only taken 30 years to learn to do the figures, out of a bought marriage and a passed-over boy, out of 2 cold bargains and an act of mercy on a freezing night. Otis Dyer had made something fine. He had made the truest thing he would ever own. Not the land he had bled for, not the brand, nor the name, nor all the broad acres. A family, held close and warm against the cold of the world. For good and for all, for as long as ever any of the 3 of them should live.